Chapter 4798. At that moment, Enchanting's gaze landed on the coffee table. It was a milk bottle with white milk inside. He frowned. You haven't weaned off milk yet? Yuan was startled and immediately picked it up and tossed it into the bin. No, someone came to visit me today with a child and left it here. Enchanting's gaze glinted. Why did you throw away someone else's stuff? I've already used it. Besides, I'm sick and it's not hygienic to leave it here for so long. What if I get infected? She stuttered and stared at Enchanting, hoping that he would believe her. Enchanting nodded his head in understanding. That's true, it's not good if you get infected. He paused for a moment. I really thought that you haven't weaned off milk yet. You've moved out for a few years now, right? It's not like you can't get rid of such a small problem. Yuan was about to vomit blood in her heart, but she still maintained a decent smile on her face. She gritted her teeth and said, I definitely don't have a problem where I can't go to sleep without drinking milk or holding a bottle. Enchanting smiled. That's good. Seems like you've been restraining yourself for the past few years. He seemed to have thought of something. Did Yi Xiangnan know that you had such a problem in the past? No. Yuan was fuming and ignored him, sitting down to watch the television. Enchanting went to the kitchen and found a cup of coffee quickly. He knew about Yuan's lifestyle since they had lived together for many years. She didn't know how to cook, but she knew how to tidy up. Her house was definitely not as messy as a single girl. Enchanting was satisfied with that. He brewed a cup of coffee. The aroma of the coffee must have alerted Yuan as she frowned. Why are you drinking coffee so late? It's already so late. Aren't you going to sleep? Enchanting checked the time. It's only 11 p.m. I usually sleep at 1 p.m. Yuan replied with an oh and continued to watch her TV. Enchanting sat on the single sofa beside her and used his phone to deal with some affairs. Sometimes, she would sneak a peek at him and found that he was really busy. Of course, Yuan was also busy, but she still had time to slack off. However, Enchanting seemed to take every opportunity to work. Although he was worth hundreds of billions, Yuan felt that he had sold himself to the Qin family. This deal was not profitable at all. Compared to her, Enchanting was more like her father, a workaholic. Of course, Yuan didn't have the face to say too much. At 12 o'clock, she stretched and said, I'm going to bed. Good night. Look, getting along with Enchanting isn't a big deal. He's still easy to get along with, although he's a little less talkative now. She couldn't help but think that after a few more interactions in the future, they might be able to be like before. In the past, it was quite good. When she said good night, Enchanting only glanced at her and casually said, Can you sleep? If he remembered correctly, she seemed to have only drunk a small portion of the milk and threw it into the trash can. According to her habits in the past, she would definitely come out to drink milk in the middle of the night. How could she sleep without hugging a milk bottle all night? And Enchanting felt that she wasn't young anymore and should have stopped drinking milk. He was quite cold. Yuan scratched her hair and went back to the bedroom. Enchanting continued with the work at hand. At 1 p.m., he turned off the lights and went to sleep in the living room. He had just laid down and hadn't fallen asleep when the sound of the door opening came from the master bedroom, followed by the sound of footsteps. Chapter 4799. Memorize. Enchanting continued with his work. At 1 o'clock, he turned off the lights and went to sleep in the living room. Before he could fall asleep, he heard the sound of the door opening from the master bedroom, followed by the sound of footsteps. A slender white figure was rummaging through the trash can in the dark. There was only one milk bottle in the house, so he couldn't fall asleep without hugging her. Enchanting just lay there quietly, not making a sound. Qin Yuan finally found the milk bottle. She gave up the idea of making another cup and wanted to hold it in her arms. Although he wasn't satisfied, at least he could fall asleep. Just as he was about to leave, he suddenly tripped over something, and he accidentally stumbled forward, falling straight onto a body on the sofa. Warm body. She was stunned and did not come back to her senses for a long time. The body even spoke, You've been weaned. Someone else's milk bottle? Then, the lights came on. Qin Yuan's gaze landed on Enchanting's face. He was lying on the sofa, and she was lying on top of him. She was holding a milk bottle in her hand, which was quite comical. Yuan felt awkward for a long time before she squeezed out a smile. It's someone else's. You're right. It's not good for me to throw away someone else's things. I'll wash it and disinfect it. It can still be used, right? Enchanting sat up and let go of her. Yuan wasn't so embarrassed anymore. She wanted to get up, but Enchanting stopped her. Let me do it. You go to sleep. Yuan glared at him. It didn't seem like he could continue acting now. He clearly knew that she wanted to hug the bottle to sleep, but he did it on purpose. He was too hateful. Yuan bit her lip. I can do it myself. Enchanting smiled faintly. Is it hard to admit that you haven't weaned yourself? As he said that, he actually went straight to the kitchen and poured out the milk skillfully. Then, he used hot water to boil the milk bottle and soaked it with milk. After testing the temperature, he came over and tossed it to her. Go to sleep. Qin Yihuan hugged the milk bottle, feeling as though she was hugging her lifeblood. However, it didn't feel good to be exposed in front of her. She didn't want to lose face, so she insisted, I didn't insist on drinking it. Put it down if you don't want to drink. Shenting said mildly, you're indeed going to stop breastfeeding. If you get married one day, will you spend your wedding night hugging a milk bottle? Yihuan was stunned by his words. After a while, she asked softly, Shenting, if it were you, would you mind? She wished she could swallow her own tongue after asking that question. She really had a cheap mouth. How could she ask such a question? Shenting's gaze was calm. After a while, he said softly, does it matter whether I mind or not? He seemed to be angry. Yihuan didn't know if she should leave or not. In the end, she sat on the sofa and hugged the milk bottle, sipping on the milk. The taste soothed the anxiety in her heart. Then, she thought shamelessly, so what if he knows? I can't change it. If Yi Xiangnan didn't want to, then they wouldn't get married. She would have to hug the milk bottle for the rest of her life. For the rest of her life. Shenting just looked at her quietly, looking at her useless look. He was sure that Yi Xiangnan didn't know and didn't like or appreciate such a habit. Actually, he didn't appreciate it either. He just indulged it for many years. But he couldn't blame Yihuan for such a habit. When she was young, she was with him when they were kidnapped. She came back unscathed, but from then on, she had a stress reaction and couldn't throw the milk bottle away. Chapter 4800. Only Shenting and Qin Mo knew about this. Because it was rather embarrassing, Yihuan did not tell Yi Xiangnan. As an adult, Qin Yihuan was drinking from the bottle. Shenting did not leave immediately, instead turning on the television as though he was accompanying her. Qin Yihuan was an adult and she was drinking from a milk bottle. Shenting did not leave immediately. Instead, he turned on the television as if accompanying her. Drink it before going to sleep. Otherwise, you won't be able to watch it on the bed. Shenting's voice was rather restrained. Drink it before you go to sleep. Otherwise, you won't be able to watch it on the bed again. Shenting's voice sounded rather restrained. Yihuan took another look at him and did not say anything else. Shenting continued watching the television. Eventually, she still felt a little weird being alone with him. She said while drinking, I'm going to sleep first. Shenting watched her leave quietly. In the end, she did not know whether he slept on the sofa or in the room. She only felt that hugging the bottle was very warm and comforting. Of course, when she woke up in the morning, she could not watch the bed as there were milk stains everywhere. Yihuan scratched her messy hair and was a little speechless. She almost jumped up. She did not know what to do. She wanted to clean up, but she did not know where to start. At this moment, Shenting appeared at the bedroom door and looked around silently. Yihuan exclaimed and scratched her hair again, saying incoherently, Auntie will come over to clean up. Shenting entered directly. It was only then that she realized that he had changed into yesterday's clothes. Hence, she asked awkwardly, are the clothes clean? What else? Get Secretary Wang to send them over and let everyone know that we spent the night together? Yihuan bit her lips. Shenting, why do you say that? It's not like. What do you mean by spent the night together? We seem to have spent the night together. His tone was unpleasant as he glanced at her. Do you have new bedsheets? Bring them over and I'll change them for you. Auntie will think too much about it. Yihuan did not understand at first. Later on, her gaze landed on the bed and she understood. Her eyes widened and her face flushed. She nodded. Yes. After searching left and right, she finally found it and handed it to Shenting. After Shenting took it, she wanted to go to the bathroom, but her arm was suddenly grabbed by him. Yihuan was startled and bit her lip. What else? Shenting's eyes lit up. Why aren't you with Yi Xiangnan? Huh? Yihuan was surprised, but after a while, she understood what he meant. What did he mean by that? Her face immediately reddened. After a moment, she spoke up once more, that's not it. Just because we don't live together doesn't mean that we don't. She didn't know what to say after that. She was a little embarrassed and annoyed. However, her words were not convincing. At least, Shenting was not convinced. He still looked at her quietly, his voice hoarse. Do you have one? This time, Yihuan's eyes were even straighter. She stared at him blankly for a while before she finally came back to her senses. She pushed him away immediately, and a faint pink blush spread from her neck to her earlobes. Without saying a word, she went straight into the bathroom and closed the door. It was obvious that she was angry. Shenting looked at the bathroom door quietly, and then quickly helped her change the bedsheets. When Yihuan came out, Shenting was no longer in the apartment. He had left. Yihuan stood in the bedroom and looked at the clean bedsheets. As if she had remembered something, she walked to the kitchen. A milk bottle had been washed and sterilized. She picked up the milk bottle and looked at it for a long time. Suddenly, she remembered Shenting's words. Why wasn't she living with Yi Xiangnan? Actually, they were about to get engaged. Why was it an engagement and not a marriage? Why weren't they living together? Perhaps it was because they were less impulsive. Yihuan put the milk bottle back in its original place. After a while, she smiled faintly. When she went out, Shenting's car had already left. She was stunned. Did he tow it away, or did he drive it away? There was an answer in her mind, but she didn't want to believe that he would do such a thing. The car was indeed driven away by Shenting. The car arrived at the headquarters of King Corporation. Shenting got out of the car. Secretary Wang was already there, reporting on the day's work. Shenting spoke as he walked. After giving a few simple instructions, he said calmly, "Spare some time in the afternoon. I have some personal matters to attend to." Secretary Wang nodded. After making the arrangements, he looked at his superior. "Mr. Shen is in a good mood today." "No." Shenting's expression darkened slightly as he walked into the elevator. Secretary Wang followed him in, smiling. He was obviously very happy. She could tell. Shenting had an afternoon meeting. At 2:00 in the afternoon, he had wanted to call Yihuan, but after thinking about it, he decided to drive there instead. She had probably forgotten to go to the hospital again when she was feeling better. This was the last time, Shenting said in his heart. But when the car reached the entrance of Yihuan's apartment, he went upstairs and rang the doorbell. The person who opened the door was not Qin Yihuan. Instead, it was Yi Xiangnan. Yi Xiangnan was wearing a simple pair of jeans and a black shirt, which outlined the graceful lines of his body. The combination of his looks and figure made him look like a scion from a manga. Shenting was also good-looking, but he had a bit more of a worldly air to him. Neither of them had expected such a scene. It was obvious that Yi Xiangnan had just gotten off the plane. With a tired look on his face, he stared at Shenting for a while before moving aside a little lazily. "Are you looking for Yihuan?" Shenting nodded. "I'll take her to the hospital." Yi Xiangnan smiled faintly. "She's not here." He paused for a moment. "Is she sick?" Then he nodded. "I understand. I'll go to the company to look for her later." Qin Yihuan wasn't here, and the main character was going to declare his sovereignty. Shenting couldn't stay no matter what. He bid farewell very appropriately. At the door, Yi Xiangnan suddenly called out to him. "Shenting." Shenting turned his head. Yi Xiangnan walked over slowly and looked at Shenting. "You still like her, don't you?" Shenting didn't say anything. Yi Xiangnan smiled faintly. Suddenly, he reached out and punched him. "You spent the night here last night, didn't you?" This punch was quite heavy. Shenting was caught off guard and fell onto the wall opposite the corridor. There was a trace of blood at the corner of his mouth. He reached out and wiped it off gently. Then, he narrowed his eyes. Yi Xiangnan took a step forward. "You won't deny it, right? I saw the smoke in the guest room. It's still damp. It should have been left by you yesterday." Shenting smiled. "Why are you so angry when you know that I slept in the guest room?" Yi Xiangnan smiled too. President Shen is still as hypocritical as ever. It's only that idiot, Yihuan, who led the wolf into the house, can't see it clearly. Shenting was definitely a wolf. If he wanted to, he could definitely swallow up the Qin family. Then, Qin Mo, Yihuan, and Qin Yihuan would have no choice but to seek refuge with Qin Xian. But you're really amazing. Even Qin Xian was moved by you. The company is under King Corporation's name and you can do whatever you want. Yi Xiangnan sneered. Chapter 4801. Memorize. But you're really something. Even Qin Xian was moved by you. The company is under King Corporation's name, and you can do whatever you want. Yi Xiangnan sneered. But speaking of which, Shenting was really the biggest and scrupulous businessman he knew. No one could be so greedy and ruthless, and yet still be so elegant. He could advance and retreat as he pleased. If he didn't enter, it would be a beautiful story. But once Shenting entered, he would have everything in his hands. Who would dare to say another word? Words had always been in the hands of those in power. Shenting leaned against the wall and looked at Yi Xiangnan. "Why are you so emotional today, CEO Yi? Is it for yourself or for Qin Yihuan?" Yi Xiangnan sneered. "You know what you're thinking. Shenting, aren't you tired of living like this? Doing so much for one person, I feel tired for you." Shenting lit a cigarette and took a drag. "It sounds like you're encouraging me." Although he said it lightly, his tone wasn't pleasant. Yi Xiangnan stared at Shenting. After a while, he said in a low voice, "Yihuan and I are about to get engaged." After he finished speaking, he slammed the door shut and left. Meanwhile, Shinting was still leaning against the wall and smoking. His dark eyes were dark, and no one could tell what he was thinking. When Shinting finished smoking and walked out, Qin Xian called Shinting. Shinting picked up. Qin Xian's voice was urgent, unlike his usual self. "Brother Shinting, something happened." Shinting was already in the car. He held the steering wheel with one hand and answered the phone with the other. "What happened?" Qin Xian paused for a moment, then said, "Yi Xiangnan had an illegitimate child. He's already a few years old." Shinting frowned, his fingers holding the steering wheel slightly curled. After a while, he said in a hoarse voice, "I'm going to find Yihuan now." Qin Xian nodded. "I'll contact Secretary Wang to suppress the news." Shinting was furious all of a sudden. Bullshit. Shouldn't this be done by Yi Xiangnan? What kind of man could he be if he couldn't even protect a woman after what he had done? What was that punch just now? Shinting liked Yihuan, but he had never thought of hurting her like this. He also disdained to take advantage of her weakness. After hanging up, the car slowed down. But when he arrived at the hospital, he found out that she was not there. She was in the company. Shinting immediately drove to King Entertainment. The building was surrounded by reporters, all waiting for the only princess of the Qin family to shed tears. The fairy tale of a princess and a prince had been shattered. The topic of Yi Xiangnan having an illegitimate child was like a blowout, and it was true. That child looked very much like Yi Xiangnan. One look and you could tell that he was from the Yi family. It was said that Yi Mubai had already beaten up his son. If the upper beam was not straight, the lower beam would be crooked. Shinting's arrival further proved that the matter was true. Otherwise, President Shen would not have appeared in person. On the way, Shinting had already called Qin Mo, indicating that he would handle this matter. As soon as he got out of the car, the reporters surrounded him in a frenzy, raising their microphones in front of Shinting. "President Shen, will there still be an engagement party?" "President Shen, if this matter is true, will Miss Qin break off the engagement, or just bring the child over to raise herself?" Shinting glanced at the reporters. Some people were still fearlessly pointing their cameras at his face. He took the phone, threw it on the ground, and stepped on it, smashing it into pieces. Chapter 4802. Shinting glanced at the reporters. Someone was still fearless enough to put the camera in his face. He took the phone, threw it on the ground and crushed it. Everyone kept quiet out of fear. Shinting looked around and said in a very soft voice, "If anyone dares to write anything, they will be going against me, Shinting." It was still quiet all around. At this moment, a female reporter suddenly asked fearlessly, "CEO Shen, I heard that you have always liked Miss Qin. Are you happy about this?" Shinting narrowed his eyes. "That's a good question. Secretary Wang, write down the name of her news agency." The female reporter who had been called out was stunned. Shinting left immediately and Secretary Wang came out to take charge. She had been with Shinting for a long time and she was like a roundworm in his stomach. Secretary Wang's voice was especially gentle, like a mother's. She gestured for everyone to be quiet. "Mr. Shen has always been an easygoing person. He has a good reputation in the industry. If your words bring bad influence to Mr. Shen or Miss Qin, a good-tempered person like Mr. Shen will be angry." The phone was smashed on the ground and he was still saying he was nice. But no one dared to say anything. Secretary Wang continued, "Miss Qin doesn't care about CEO Ye's private life. Besides, it's normal that you don't know about their past. I understand that you are on a mission and CEO Shen understands even more. He can't let anyone lose their jobs, can he?" At this point, he had reached the main point. Secretary Wang smiled even more warmly. "Of course, you can write. Democracy has long been achieved and everyone is free, right? But this happened in CEO Ye's house. Of course, you can write about CEO Yi, but this has nothing to do with Miss Qin and CEO Shen. If you want to write, there should be a limit. You can't drag innocent people into this, right? If you write something like that, not only CEO Shen or Miss Qin, even I will be angry." Secretary Wang smiled. "Don't you think so?" "That's right. This logic seems to be logic. But gossip had no limits. Otherwise, what was the point of writing?" But Shinting's attitude made it clear. Whoever dared to write nonsense would be killed. Who would have thought that President Shen, who usually looked gentle and amiable, was even more difficult to deal with than Yi Xiangnan from the Yi family? There was nothing left for them to stay. Hence, the reporters dispersed. After Secretary Wang settled the matter, he called Shinting and returned to the headquarters early. Shinting went straight to the top floor. He had worked for King Entertainment for a long time, but he had never been the CEO of King Entertainment. Qin Mo had directly set up a corporation for him to take over. He went to the CEO's office on the top floor, where Qin Yihuan was sitting, crying. As soon as Shenting opened the door, he saw a pile of tissues in front of the sofa. They were all used to wipe his snot. Shenting stood at the door with his arms crossed. I thought you wanted a milk bottle. Yihuan quickly looked up and stared at him. After a while, she bit her lips and said with red eyes, I don't want to. I'm weaned. Shenting walked over and squatted in front of her. He looked up at her and said, then tell me, weaning or breaking up with Yi Xiangnan, which is harder? It's equally hard, she said without thinking. Shenting smiled slightly and then smiled bitterly. I won't force you to wean anymore. Chapter 4803. Yihuan looked at Shenting and pursed her lips. After a long while, she looked out the window. Shenting, why are you here? Without waiting for him to reply, she said softly, don't you hate me? Shenting was still squatting in front of her. He reached out to touch her hair, but then gave up. Yihuan sniffed. Then you must be here to laugh at me. I'm so bad. Shenting smiled. I'll take you to the hospital. You have to be on the drip again today. I don't want to go. Yihuan looked down. The whole world is waiting to laugh at me. Shenting nodded. Yeah, losing Yi Xiangnan is terrible. What if I lose the milk bottle today? Yihuan widened her eyes and looked at him. Shenting sat down. It seems like the world hasn't collapsed yet. If you think that you can't live without Yi Xiangnan, then go find him now and tell him that you can accept an extra child. You can either bring the child back and raise it yourself, or accept his wives and concubines. Yihuan covered her face. How is that possible? If you can't accept it, then let it go. It's a simple choice, isn't it? He sighed. Follow me to the hospital. Yihuan was dragged along by him. Then she said in a daze, what about you, Shenting? Is it a simple choice too? Shenting didn't stop walking. If you really want to hear it, I don't mind telling you. Of course, Yihuan didn't want to hear it. She didn't dare to. She and Shenting walked out together. Unbeknownst to her, a group of reporters had gathered outside, blocking the parking lot of King Entertainment. Shenting looked at her. If you hide for a day, these people will follow you. Are you sure you want to hide forever? Yihuan didn't say anything. She just opened Shenting's car door and got in. It was the same car from the other day. It was obvious that he had left it at her apartment that night. Noticing that she was looking at him, Shenting smiled faintly. Isn't it normal for me to take care of you for one night when you're sick? Yihuan didn't say anything and just sat there quietly. Shenting took a tissue and handed it over. Tidy yourself up. Your face is all messed up from crying. It's so ugly. Yihuan glanced at the rearview mirror. Indeed, her face was smudged and her eyes were swollen. Shenting started the car and whispered after a long time, do you really like him that much? It's none of your business. Yihuan bit her lip and snorted. Shenting focused on the road ahead and took a moment to whisper, do you care more about Yi Xiangnan or your own reputation more? Yihuan took a deep breath. I don't care about my reputation. Shenting turned his head and glanced at her. He didn't say anything and drove to Shengyuan Hospital. Of course, Yihuan was surrounded by people all the way there. After all, Yi Xiangnan's incident was too sensational. The main thing was that Yi Xiangnan had admitted that the child was his. Such an admission was tantamount to giving up on Qin Yihuan. On one side was a child born by an unknown woman, and on the other side was Qin Yihuan, who was worth hundreds of billions. Yi Xiangnan had easily chosen the child. He called Yihuan, but Yihuan didn't pick up. She didn't want to pick up, not because she was angry, but because she didn't want to talk to him at all. Her feelings were over. She had her own pride. Yihuan was on an 4 drip and didn't speak. It would be a lie to say that she wasn't sad. Since many years ago, her wish had been to marry Xiangnan's brother. Because of Yi Xiangnan, she didn't have long hair. Because of Yi Xiangnan, she didn't wear dresses. It had become a habit. Chapter 4804. That was how the world collapsed. The only exception was that she had a short period of time with Shenting in the middle. In fact, she knew very well that ever since that night, not only had her relationship with Shenting changed, but her relationship with Yi Xiangnan had also changed. So, when Shenting asked her which was more important, Yi Xiangnan or her face, she said it was face. She knew that the child or Yi Xiangnan might not remember that night. It might even have happened unintentionally. And if she really loved him, she wouldn't be so determined. It was because she didn't love him enough that she was so decisive. Yi Xiangnan, too. Yihuan was silent for a long time before she looked at Shenting. You knew it, didn't you? Shenting sat beside her and said calmly, Yi Xiangnan has an illegitimate child? I'm not a prophet, so how could I have known? Yihuan looked down. Between me and Yi Xiangnan, Shenting laughed. How would I know what happened between the two of you? This was a very sly answer. Yihuan was stunned for a moment and then didn't say anything. Shinting smiled faintly and didn't say anything. After the drip was connected, Yihuan said, "You don't have to care about me." Shinting waited for her to put on her coat before saying, "Uncle called and asked you to stay with me for the next few days." She widened her eyes. "You still want to stay at my place?" Shinting's voice was very calm. "Stay at my apartment." Yihuan never knew that he had bought an apartment outside. She thought that he would stay in the villa for the rest of his life and even marry a wife and have children. She looked at him strangely and refused. "I can live by myself." "Then what? Are you going to stay at home and cry because of the reporters?" She was a little angry. "I won't stay at home and cry. Go live with me." Shinting's voice was a little hoarse. "After everything is over, you can live wherever you want." Yihuan's lips moved, but she didn't say anything in the end. They walked out of the hospital and got into Shinting's car. When they got on the car, they were surrounded by reporters as usual. Fortunately, Shinting had made arrangements beforehand, so they could get on the car smoothly. "Do you want to go to my place now? I want to take something." "There's always something that needs to be taken," Yihuan said softly. Shinting turned the car in another direction. "Go buy it. The ground floor of your apartment is probably full of reporters. It's not good to be photographed." Yihuan just looked at him. She felt that his reason wasn't sufficient, but she didn't say anything. Shinting drove for about 20 minutes. First, he took her to a restaurant. This restaurant was much more private than the vegetarian restaurant that day, mainly to avoid the reporters. Sitting in the private room, Shinting was ordering dishes when Yihuan's phone rang. She glanced at it and saw that it was Yi Xiangnan calling. So he hung up. Shinting seemed to know who the caller was. His voice was calm as he said, "If you want to answer it, then answer it. It's not a good thing to be in a deadlock." As he said that, he glanced at her. Yihuan didn't say anything. Shinting continued to order dishes, most of which were nourishing. The manager served them personally. One look at the two of them and she knew it. And this meal, although delicious, was tasteless. Yihuan was listless. Later, halfway through the meal, Yi Xiangnan called again. This time, Yihuan picked up. She only heard a few words from the other side and hung up. Then, he continued to eat quietly. Shinting stared at her. Chapter 4805. Yihuan looked down. "We've agreed to announce our breakup tomorrow." Shinting didn't say anything. He just put some food in her bowl. "Your favorite." Yihuan ate it. "I don't have an appetite." Shinting smiled faintly. "That's true. You can't eat when you've just broken up. Then don't eat." She looked up at him. Her expression was a little confused. Shinting had already picked up his coat and stood up. "Let's go shopping." "Oh." Yihuan also picked up her coat and stood up. She thought she was going to drive, but Shinting brought her to an elevator. "The mall is above. There are many home furnishing stores." Yihuan stood beside him. They looked like a couple. At this time, the elevator opened again on the upper floor, and more than 10 people came in. Yihuan was pushed to the side, and Shinting grabbed her, and then her back was pressed against his chest. "Be careful." Shinting's voice sounded above her. Yihuan was a little embarrassed. At this moment, the people at the door of the elevator squeezed in. Yihuan had no choice but to stick closer to him. The people in front of her made her feel uncomfortable. Shinting stretched out a hand in front of her waist, blocking her from the others. But this meant that she was in his arms. Her nose was filled with a pleasant masculine smell. It was refreshing and had a faint smell of tobacco. Yihuan struggled a little. Shinting murmured, "Don't move." Ah. Soon, she didn't dare to move. She just quietly moved her body. Shinting's arm tightened. When they walked out of the elevator, the way Yihuan looked at him was especially strange. Shinting smiled. "Is there a problem?" Yihuan said, "Of course there's no problem." Not only was there no problem, but it was also very good. Because she didn't bring anything, he bought everything for her from head to toe. Pajamas, sweaters, shoes, and so on. Shinting let her make her own decisions and only occasionally gave some advice. Basically, Yihuan felt that shopping with Shinting wasn't bad, and she wouldn't feel particularly cold either. She wondered if he would be like this when he was with Baianan. Shinting stood up and said, "Let me do it." Yihuan looked at him. "I brought my card." Shinting held her arm with one hand and gently pulled her to the side. He quickly swiped his card. After he was done, he looked at the bill. It was only 100,000 yuan. He looked at her. "You don't have to save money for me. That's not it. I don't think I need to limit the number of pieces I usually wear, right?" Yihuan said weakly. Usually, she was still very casual, especially now that she was living at Shanting's place. Of course, she would not be particularly grand, that would seem very strange. Shanting looked at it and could roughly guess what she was thinking. He did not say anything and directly picked up the things. Ihuan thought that they would go back soon. She was also a little tired. Shanting took her to a household goods store, which was an Italian brand. Don't tell me you only have one set of tableware and other things? She looked at Shanting suspiciously. Shanting smiled slightly and did not say anything. He just strolled casually. She could only follow him. Shanting quickly picked a set of cups and asked someone to wrap it up. Ihuan only felt that he was bored today. Secretary Wang often called her and said that her Mr. Shen was very busy every day. However, Ihuan felt that Shanting seemed to be very idle. He had been working for half a day these days, but he was still in the mood to pick things. Chapter 4806. She added, "For by Anan?" That set of cups looked like it was for a girl and she liked it a lot. Shanting seemed a little surprised as he raised his brows. "It's for my own use at home." She replied with an "oh" before questioning his taste. Shanting continued shopping and picked up a few more items. There was even a crystal vase. It was an ordinary vase but it was small and it cost more than $1 million. He bought it without blinking. Ihuan felt that Shanting was very much like a woman. Only women would spend money like that. He picked everything while she followed behind him. When they reached a row of cabinets, Shanting said softly, "See which one you like." Ihuan was stunned for a moment before she widened her eyes and looked at the row of milk bottles. They were all very cute. There were pink ones, light yellow ones, pink and blue ones. There were all kinds of milk bottles. Ihuan bit her lower lip. "Are you buying them for me?" "Take your pick," he said generously. Ihuan liked all of them very much. She counted them. There were about 12 in one row, and 24 in 2 rows. She touched them with her hand and turned to look at Shanting. Shanting placed his hand on his forehead and called for the shop assistant. "Wrap up these 2 rows. We'll take one with us and have it delivered to the address tomorrow." The shop assistant was also stunned for a moment. Although this gentleman had just bought the most expensive vase in their store, she still needed to tell him, "Sir, this kind of milk bottle is the only one. The price is 12,000 yuan per bottle." Expensive? That was how expensive their products were. People were willing to buy them. Shanting nodded. "Wrap them up. I'll take them all." The shop assistant's eyes were filled with stars. Madam was too rich. She quickly brought Shanting to swipe his card. Other than the milk bottles, he carried everything else away. Ihuan hugged one of her favorite milk bottles and followed behind him. After a while, she jumped up and said, "You're quite strong." He glanced at her. "I'll go to the gym." Ihuan thought for a moment and gently pinched his arm. Shanting looked at her again and realized that she had probably forgotten about Yixiangnan, at least for now. He lowered his eyes and thought to himself, "Sure enough, the milk bottle is more important than Yixiangnan." When they arrived at the parking lot, he immediately stuffed Ihuan into the car and turned on the heater. He carefully put the things in the trunk. When he got into the car, he looked at the time. It was already 9 o'clock in the evening. "Let's go back." After he finished speaking, he looked at Ihuan. She was still playing with her milk bottle. She looked quite engrossed in it. She had probably already thought of how to hug it to sleep tonight. Ihuan suddenly said, "I forgot the milk powder. Why don't you get it from my place? I'll buy it." Shanting started the car. "It's the brand you usually like to drink." Ihuan replied with an "oh" and continued to hug it. Then, she felt that there was something wrong with their conversation. She did not say anything because it was really embarrassing. It was not a glorious thing for a 25-year-old to hug a milk bottle to sleep. However, when she thought about how this person was Shanting who had watched her grow up, she felt that it was only natural. After driving for about 10 minutes, they arrived at Shanting's apartment. When Ihuan got out of the car, she realized that it was a prime location in B City. Moreover, it was an apartment above a hotel. It was about 200,000 yuan per square meter. Shanting's apartment was 600 square meters and took up an entire floor. Moreover, the interior decoration was quite luxurious. It was a style that she had not expected. Chapter 4807. Shanting opened the door and let her sit wherever she wanted. He tidied up his things and went to dry Ihuan's clothes. The teacups and other things were all put away. This was originally a decent room that probably had no one living in it. However, after adding some things, it became livelier. Ihuan looked around and heard that he was busy. He should be in the room in front. She stretched her head and saw that Shanting was drying his clothes. He had just washed all the clothes he had bought and was drying them. "You can wear the pajamas now. These will be dried tomorrow." Shinting handed her a set of pajamas. His beautiful fingers touched the pajamas, and the scene was a little shocking. Yihuan looked at it in a daze for a while and reached out to take it. The pajamas had a very dry feeling with a hint of fragrance. It was very comfortable to touch and smell. She took it and put it back in the guest room. Shinting had also asked her to sleep in it, and it was next to his master bedroom. When she reached the room, Yihuan realized that this bedroom should be prepared for ladies. The style was very aesthetic and didn't seem like a place where Shinting would live. She thought that it was probably Bainen's room. However, a voice told her, if Bainen really came over, did she need to sleep in the guest room? With that thought, she put down the pajamas in her hands and looked around. The cabinet in the changing room was empty. There was a full set of female products in the bathroom, none of which had been opened. There was also a cute pink bathtub in the middle of the bathroom. Yihuan blinked in disbelief. After she grew up, she didn't need a pink bathtub anymore. She had one when she was young. She blinked gently and turned around. Shinting was behind her. He smiled. Do you like it? Yihuan looked at him for a long time before biting her lips. It's very expensive, right? Shinting's expression was a little strange. I thought you would ask why there was a pink bathtub instead of worrying about whether it's expensive. After all, whether it was the Qin family or Shinting, it wasn't a big problem to buy such a bathtub. Yihuan pursed her lips. I just feel that I've grown up. I don't need to have one everywhere. It's too extravagant. Shinting chuckled. How did you know that this was specially bought for you? Ah. Yihuan didn't say anything. It seemed that she had just realized that this was a very hidden problem. Yeah, why did she feel that he had bought it for her the moment she saw the pink bathtub? Was it because she had owned it before? Perhaps Bainen liked it too. At this time, she was a little depressed, feeling that she had thought too highly of herself. His lips quivered. I think I'm overthinking things. She smiled bitterly, but Shinting just looked at her. No one has used it before. You're the first. As he spoke, he walked out. Yihuan followed him out and suddenly said, Shinting, I'm very possessive. Shinting suddenly stopped and turned to look at her. Yihuan didn't move. Her voice was very soft. So, don't be too nice to me. Shinting's lips curled up. I promised Uncle Qin that I would take care of you. Yihuan pursed her lips. She felt that she had thought too highly of herself again. She went to make milk alone. When she was unhappy, she would drink some milk. When the taste of the milk melted in her mouth, it seemed that her mood would be much better. She kicked off her shoes and curled up on the sofa. She wanted to watch TV, but the moment she turned it on, she saw the news of her and Yi Xiangnan breaking off their engagement. She played with her phone. They were also the top trending topic. It seemed that they were everywhere in the world. Chapter 4808. She curled up on the sofa, intending to watch television. However, the moment she turned it on, all she saw was the news of her and Yi Xiangnan breaking off their engagement. She played with her phone. They were the top trending topic as well. It was as though the entire world was filled with news about them. Yihuan threw her phone down and switched off the television, sitting there in a huff. She was reminded of something that she had temporarily forgotten. She lowered her head, looking extremely dejected. Shinting made a cup of coffee and sat beside her. The news is so overwhelming that it's hard to guard against it. She did not say anything, merely hugging the milk bottle and leaning on his shoulder gently. Shinting, don't push me away. I just want to lean on you for a while, just a while. She was a little tired. Perhaps it was because after maintaining their relationship for so many years, she was already tired. She did not know whose problem it was between her and Yi Xiangnan, but it was different from others. They had both tried their best. Perhaps, they had been waiting for the other party to break up with them. No one had said that they would get engaged. They had yet to experience happiness. Actually, even if they got engaged and married, it would still be the same. Yihuan could not find the feelings that she liked back then. It should be the same for Yi Xiangnan as well. She wasn't a block of wood either. She could more or less sense the changes in men. Yihuan leaned against Shinting, and he also let her lean against him. Brother Shinting, am I a failure? I've lost a lot of things. Her voice carried a tinge of vulnerability. Maybe it's because I'm too greedy. I'm such a bad person. That's why I'm like this, right? Shinting's gaze was a little calm. After a long time, he said softly, no. He lowered his head. Yihuan, do you really love him that much? Yihuan could not say it out loud. She had only truly matured in the past few years. All her attention seemed to be on Shinting and her estrangement. As for her relationship with Yi Xiangnan, she did not really care much. That realization made her jump up immediately. When she stood up, her face was not looking too good. She ran her fingers through her hair gently. After a long time, she mumbled, I'm going to sleep first. Shinting pulled her to sit down. Stay with me for a while. I'm going to finish my coffee. Oh, she replied and then leaned against the sofa, looking quite obedient. Shinting drank his coffee for half an hour. When he was about to take a sip, there was a knock on the door. Open the door. He moved his chin. Yihuan supported her head with her hand. It's so late. Who would come? However, she still went to open the door. To her surprise, there was a delivery boy at the door. He was holding a very delicate box with a black rose in it. Mr. Shen specially flew it here. The young man smiled warmly and asked Yihuan to sign it. Yihuan was stunned for a moment, but she quickly signed it. She took it back, hugged it, and looked at Shinting. One rose by air. Aren't you exaggerating a little too much? I bought a vase, didn't I? He put down the coffee cup in his hand, walked over to take the box, opened it, and asked her to fill the vase with water, prune the branches, and put them in. Put it on your bedside. He handed it to her. Yihuan felt that it was very strange. She took it. Is it a gift? Yes. He sighed softly. I should have prepared an engagement gift for you. Now I can save a lot of money. Yihuan looked at him. But I feel that you seem to be gloating. Am I? Shinting actually laughed. Yihuan put the vase down. Looking at the rose with dew on it, she suddenly thought of something. Where's the gift you were talking about? Chapter 4809. Memorize. Yihuan put the vase down and looked at the dewy rose. She suddenly remembered something. Where's the present you were talking about? I'll give it to you at your next engagement, he said meaningfully. Yihuan sighed. I don't know when the next time will be. You sound like you're looking forward to it? Shinting asked without batting an eyelid. Yihuan blushed. After a long time, she said, I want to go abroad to Italy to learn photography. Maybe for a few years. Shinting frowned slightly. Did you suddenly have such an idea after being dealt a blow? What about King Entertainment? Don't tell me you're throwing it to me again? I won't accept it. He paused. Many people are already saying that I'm trying to get the Qin family. If you go abroad, I really won't be able to clear my name. Yihuan fiddled with the vase and said nonchalantly, Dad doesn't care who inherits it. Also, I don't think you care if you can clear your name. Besides, are you very fair? At that moment, in her bedroom, Shinting narrowed his eyes. I thought you already knew. Already knew? What do you mean already knew? Yihuan took a few seconds to understand what he meant. Then she blushed. He was really shameless. But she had done it on purpose that night. She was in the wrong, so no matter how embarrassed she was, she thickened her skin and pretended she didn't understand. They were still living together now. Just as she was about to move out the next day, Shinting asked again, You think I'm a scammer? He held out his arm to her. So that was it. Yihuan let out a long sigh of relief. Remembering the topic earlier, she continued, I always wanted to go to Italy, but I thought I'd get married and have children. Now that I'm not in a hurry, I might as well go away for 2 or 3 years. Besides, there's not much to do here at King Entertainment. I can handle it in Italy. Dad, you and Qin Xian are the most important things. She said this as if she had already made up her mind. Shinting stared at her and said softly, That's good. What was good? Yihuan didn't understand what he meant and didn't dare to ask. But it didn't seem as uncomfortable now. Shinting walked out of her bedroom and said, I'll make you another glass of milk, but when you sleep, it's best if you don't hug it. It's the same if you put it beside your pillow after drinking it, or hug an empty bottle. I don't want to come over early in the morning to help you change your bed sheets. Yihuan blushed. At this time, Shinting turned her head and suddenly smiled. Actually, it's a good thing not to marry Yi Xiangnan. I can't imagine him changing your bed sheets every day. He teased her for a long time, and Yihuan finally couldn't stand it anymore. She took a pillow and threw it at him. I curse you to never get a wife and to never change the sheets for me. Shinting seemed to be stunned for a moment, then he smiled. As long as you're not married, I don't mind you staying here. Stay here all this time? She didn't want to. She wasn't his wife. Plus, Bai Anan would be unhappy. Yihuan thought as she showered. When she came out, the milk bottle was already on her bedside. She drank 2 mouthfuls and poked her head out. Shinting was working. He wasn't in the study, but in the living room. His laptop was on his knees and a cup of coffee was beside him. Chapter 4810. She took 2 sips and poked her head out. Shinting was working. He wasn't in the study, but in the living room. His laptop was on his knees, and there was a cup of coffee beside him. Yihuan adjusted her pajamas and ran over to lean against him. You're still working? Shinting, you work all day. Do you have time to find a girlfriend? His fingers tapped on the keyboard, and he didn't even raise his head. Isn't Bai Anan your girlfriend? Actually, it was probably true. If she married Yi Xiangnan, he and Bai Anan might really get married one day. The kind that was as calm as water, and they wouldn't be attracted to each other. At least, Shenting wanted to be serious about Bai Anan, but they weren't attracted to each other. He didn't have the time and energy to find another woman who was attracted to him. So, if his parents really urged him to marry Bai Anan when he was old enough, he would marry Bai Anan directly. A perfect marriage partner with good genes, a good family background, and a good match. That was enough. But now, it was different. Qin Yihuan and Yi Xiangnan suddenly broke off the engagement. To be honest, Shenting didn't feel ecstatic. He was angry with her, and he didn't plan to take advantage of her now. He just wanted to take care of her. So, he told her that Bai Anan was his girlfriend. He didn't need to explain to Yihuan about the tacit understanding between him and Bai Anan. If he told her everything, the ending wouldn't be any different from the night Yihuan turned 18. Shenting was no longer the Shenting from 7 years ago. He was mature and a little scheming. Actually, it was just like what Yi Xiangnan said. If he wanted the entire Qin family, he could do it in a matter of minutes. The reason why he didn't move wasn't because of Qin Mo and Yihuan's care, but because of Yihuan. So, he set himself in a position where he didn't need to look up to her, but he was still a good person. He had real power, but no one dared to say that he made the Qin family a mere figurehead. Shenting also understood that all of this was tacitly approved by Qin Mo. All of these gave him a sense of propriety. This was a man's way. Perhaps Qin Mo had already made his choice. After Shenting said that, Yihuan said, "Oh, that's right. You have a girlfriend." Shenting nodded. "She's quite busy, so she's not clingy. Most of the time, she doesn't go on dates. All girls like to date. There are very few workaholics." Yihuan sighed while holding the milk bottle. She seemed to be very experienced. Shenting smiled. "What about you? I haven't seen you and Yi Xiangnan go on many dates in the past few years." It wasn't that he paid too much attention to her, but Yi Xiangnan spent most of his time abroad. Yihuan wasn't very busy, but she wouldn't accompany him. That child was probably born during these periods of time. Shenting heard that Yi Xiangnan's side was about to explode, and so was the Yi family. He heard that it was a young girl, and she was quite cute. And the child's biological mother was an insignificant secretary under Star's Entertainment. He didn't know when she had climbed into Yi Xiangnan's bed, but he had such a young girl. Shenting thought silently again. Yi Xiangnan already had a child. He looked at Yihuan again and sighed. Yihuan didn't know what he was thinking. She was stunned for a while before she said, "We're different." "What's the difference?" "You just feel that you like each other, that you want to be together, and that you want to get married. The process isn't important. What's important is that you marry that person," Shenting said bluntly. Chapter 48:11. Yihuan was speechless. Although she didn't want to admit it, Shenting was right. All these years, her relationship with Yi Xiangnan was as calm as water. It couldn't be said that there were no feelings at all, but it was very faint. But no matter what, this news had an impact on both Yihuan and King Entertainment's stock price. It couldn't be seen now, but the company would probably be very busy tomorrow morning. Shenting knew what was going on. Although it would be chaotic for a while, it wouldn't collapse. Now, what was important was Yihuan's mood. Because Yi Xiangnan would get married in the future. Whether he loved the woman or not, the Yi family style was to accept the child and marry the woman. And Yihuan was alone, so Shenting wouldn't get involved at this time. So when she said she was going abroad, he didn't agree at first, but now he felt that it was good for her to go abroad. Shenting looked at her speechless face and smiled. "Let's not talk about this. Go to bed early." He moved his chin. "I still have some work to do. Go to bed first." Yihuan was still lying beside him. After hearing that, she got up lazily and hugged the bottle in her arms. Shenting smiled gently. "You really don't want to change this habit? I've already broken up. I don't know when my next love will be. What's the use of changing now?" She muttered, obviously looking for an excuse for herself. Shenting smiled warmly. But Yihuan didn't leave immediately. Instead, she stood there for a long time. "What's wrong?" Shenting asked her softly. Yihuan took a step forward and sat beside him. She said in a low voice, "It's been a long time since you talked to me like this." With that, she boldly put her hand on his shoulder. Shenting's attention wasn't on the laptop, but on the torturous girl in front of him. "I'm working. I know. I'm still angry at you. I know too. I have a girlfriend." After a pause, Shenting said so. Yihuan glanced at him and suddenly put her arms around his neck. She said, "I don't care." He was the one who had brought her back. Now, he was her big brother Shanting. However, her Shanting was not by Ainan's boyfriend. He still wanted to say something, but her voice was very low. Either you kick me out. Shanting sighed softly. Yihuan, you are really headstrong and selfish. His selfishness wasn't directed at Bai Ainan, because there was nothing between him and Bai Ainan in the first place. He was referring to how intimate they were right now. When he didn't want to let go, she ran away and wanted to keep a distance from him. This was something Shanting could not accept. He stared at her. Yihuan didn't say anything. She just hugged him. Just like what he said, she was selfish and righteous. You can either marry Bai Ainan and ignore me. She suddenly looked up and said. In that instant, Shanting saw a hint of certainty in her eyes, as well as mischievousness and even a little naughtiness. In that instant, he understood everything. So it wasn't that Yihuan couldn't see through it. She knew everything. At least, she could guess most of it. Suddenly, a hint of anger rose in his heart. The laptop in his hand was thrown to the side. Then, she fell into his arms. After that, he didn't know who kissed who first. In short, they were impudent. Chapter 48:12. Shanting left gracefully. He still had some matters to settle. He was really a busy man. Secretary Wang was not exaggerating at all. Moreover, he had been accompanying Yihuan for the past few days, so he had a lot of things to settle. After he left, Yihuan couldn't sleep. It was useless to lie on the bed with the bottle in her hand. She couldn't fall asleep no matter how she tossed and turned. She clearly didn't recognize the bed. At 1:00 at night, she still couldn't stand it anymore. She got up and looked outside. Shanting was still working. He heard the movement and turned his head. Why aren't you sleeping? Heat the milk. Yihuan coughed lightly. Shanting laughed and said, Qin Yihuan, do you really think of yourself as a baby? It was enough that she held the bottle, but she still had to heat the milk at night. Yihuan was quite righteous. It doesn't taste good when it's cold. She went to heat the milk. Shanting saw that she was busy, so he closed the notebook and walked behind her to take the bottle from her hand. Make another cup. Yihuan watched him pour the milk in the bottle and said with a little heartache, what a waste. Shanting glanced at her and didn't say anything in the end. Yihuan didn't say anything and smiled fakely. He made her another cup of milk and said a little speechlessly, you drink this all day long. You smell like milk. Yes, the 25-year-old Yihuan still smelled like milk, but it smelled good. Shanting didn't tell her that it smelled good. This was also one of the reasons why he didn't object to her drinking milk. He liked the smell very much. As a mature man, a man who had a lot of things to deal with every day, he wouldn't take the initiative to say it. Shanting put the bottle in her hand and smiled. Sleep soon. Yihuan nodded and walked a few steps. Suddenly, all the electricity was cut off. Then, there was a flash in the sky, accompanied by the sound of thunder. It was dark all around, and she couldn't see her fingers in front of her. Yihuan instinctively hugged Shanting. Her teeth were chattering. I can't see anymore. Shanting's heart ached. He knew that she was afraid of the dark and that she couldn't be alone in a confined space, because she had been locked up as a child. They were kidnapped together and locked together in a small dark room. There was no one else, no food, and no water. They endured for more than 30 hours. All they had was Shanting's warm embrace. Yihuan was very afraid. She gently curled up in his arms. She was very afraid that Shanting would also disappear. Don't be afraid, I'm here. He comforted her softly, then made a call to find out when the electricity would be restored. However, the news he got from his phone was not good. He picked her up and walked to the window. Outside, there was a thunderstorm. Within 10 minutes, the streets were filled with water. This rain was unprecedentedly heavy. Shanting looked at it and then lowered his head. I don't think he can make it tonight. Yihuan hugged him tightly and refused to let go. He was a little helpless. Yihuan. I won't let go. Her little face was buried in his arms. I'm afraid. She was really afraid. She was afraid of the dark. Even holding the bottle didn't help. Shanting had no choice but to carry her to his bedroom. Although she couldn't see, the master bedroom had his scent, and it smelled very good. Shanting's voice was soft. Sleep first, okay? Yihuan was still clinging to him like a little bear. Shanting sighed. I'm going to take a shower. But she didn't even give him a chance to take a shower. She just hugged him and said like a kitten, I'm afraid. Chapter 48:13. Shanting was in a dilemma. He reached out to hold the little girl in his arms and sighed, I'll come over in a while after I take a shower, okay? No. She was still clinging to him, unwilling to let go. Shanting closed his eyes. When he opened them again, his fingers gently touched her hair, slowly moved to her ears, and gently pulled. Be good. Yi-Huan refused. Not only did she refuse, but she also pressed her little face against his chest and hugged him even tighter. Shenting's heart was breaking down. He was always a man. But now, he couldn't leave her alone. After hesitating for a moment, he reached out and hugged her. They lay down together and hugged her, comforting her. At this time, not only her, but Shenting himself also remembered that dark night. He let out a sigh and maintained this position, hugging her tightly. Probably because she could feel his body temperature. After a long time, Yi-Huan relaxed and leaned into his arms. Shenting asked her softly, what if there was a power outage at home in the past? I'll have backup power, she whispered. Her hot breath sprayed on his shirt and seeped into his skin. She felt that hugging and talking like this was particularly intimate. Although she often did this when she was a child, after all, they were very young at that time, and there was nothing wrong with it. But now she was a girl, and Shenting was a mature man. This was wrong. At least, it shouldn't be like this. He also knew that she was afraid, but he let her be like this. It was his fault. Shenting closed his eyes slightly. After a moment, he gave up struggling. On such a night, he hugged her, just like when she was a child. Outside, there was a storm, and inside the room, there was a trace of coldness. But Yi-Huan was warm. She curled up in his arms like a little animal, feeling very comfortable. In the middle of the night, she woke up in a daze and saw Shenting when she opened her eyes. In the darkness, his eyes were open. Yi-Huan said in a daze, "You're not sleeping." "How?" he said helplessly. Yi-Huan arched, and in the end, the blanket covered him. She lay back down again and said with a sigh, "You're wearing clothes." This logic was really not bad. Shenting let out a long sigh. He held her head in his big hand and stroked it gently. Yi-Huan said vaguely, "I won't tell anyone." He was both amused and angry. Did she really think that something would happen between me and Bai Anan? Although he didn't deny that he had such a plan, at this stage, he and Bai Anan were indeed nothing. Shenting lowered his head and finally kissed her forehead. His voice was a little hoarse. "All right, let's sleep." "Oh," she replied obediently. She quickly fell asleep. How could Shenting fall asleep so easily? The girl that he had longed for more than 10 years was in his arms. Just his mood alone was enough to make him excited. He held her in his arms until the rain stopped and the world returned to its original brightness. However, as he hugged her, he carefully turned off all the lights in the bedroom. He lowered his head and carefully pressed her in his arms. That night, there was a storm, but it seemed to be calm. Early in the morning, Yi-Huan woke up. Shenting was no longer by her pillow. She sat up and realized that it was Shenting's bed. The gray sheets and the pillow with his scent reminded her of last night. Chapter 48:14. Memorize. Thinking of last night, Yi-Huan buried her head. Shen-Yin spoke. She didn't want to see anyone. Just as she buried her face in the pillow, Shenting appeared at the door. "Get up and eat breakfast. I think you won't be too free today. If you don't show up, the reporters won't let you off. I'll send you to the company after breakfast. PR or whatever, you know what to do." Yi-Huan turned over and lay flat on her back. She stared at the ceiling in a daze. After a while, she said softly, "Ever since I took over King Entertainment, there have been many crises in PR. But I never thought that one day, I would have to deal with my own personal affairs." Shenting straightened up and said calmly, "So this incident reminds us not to fall in love at such a young age." Yi-Huan jumped up immediately. "You're the one in love at such a young age, you're the one in love at such a young age." Shenting ignored her and went straight to the dining room. "Hurry up, or you'll be late. The media will accuse you of being too sad." Her answer was to throw a pillow behind him, which hit Shenting's waist. Shenting turned and looked at her for a few seconds before bending over to pick up the pillow. He patted it and put it back on the bed. Yi-Huan bit her lip. He smiled. "If you're not so sad, then get up and settle your own affairs. Wipe your PG clean before going abroad. Otherwise, you'll seem too useless." Yi-Huan harumphed and lifted the blanket to go to the bathroom. She had forgotten that she was in the master bedroom and naturally went in. Shenting looked on quietly, and his eyes were dyed with a wisp of deep thought. When Yi-Huan came out, Shenting was already in the dining room. She had changed into her own clothes and was sitting next to him. Shenting was reading an English morning paper. He turned to look at her. "Have some warm milk." She took a sip embarrassedly and looked at Shenting. "Are you going to King Entertainment?" She felt that Shenting cared a lot about anything that affected the market value of the stock. But Shenting just glanced at her and said casually, "You can handle such a small matter yourself." "It's just a small matter." Yi-Huan sighed softly. Shenting continued, "Don't drive these days. I'll drive you." Yihuan refused without thinking. Aren't you very busy? I still have time to spare, he said calmly. Actually, he was right. The internal structure of the group was already very stable. They were busy only because of their ambitions. If they did not have such big ambitions, they would not be so busy. After Shinting finished speaking, Yihuan looked at him while chewing on her bread, as if she was sizing him up. Hurry up and eat. He patted her hand, his voice indifferent. Yihuan suddenly said, I won't tell by Anan what happened last night. Shinting looked up. He didn't seem to catch her point, but after a while, he roughly understood what she was talking about. He frowned and said, whatever. Yihuan was unhappy. She bit her lips and said, what do you mean by casual? You are too casual. Shinting smiled slightly. What else? The smile on his face suddenly disappeared. He looked at her quietly and said, Qin Yihuan, did you really sleep with me last night just because you were afraid? Yihuan was stunned for a moment and looked straight at him. After a long while, Shinting asked with a faint smile, just because you were afraid? This time, Yihuan answered him quickly, of course. Chapter 48:15. Shinting's smile deepened and he didn't say anything else. He just took his jacket, changed his shoes, and sat on the sofa waiting for her. He had a lot of things to deal with. He called Secretary Wang on his phone while waiting for Yihuan. Yihuan was still in shock. Shinting's casual words made her restless. How should she put it? It reminded her of the night when she was 18 years old. She had also shamelessly pestered Shinting like this. At that time, Shinting didn't have a girlfriend. Now, he had Anan. She said she wouldn't say it, but was there any difference? Just like what Shinting said, was she really just afraid? Or was it in her heart? She had always felt that Shinting was hers. Regardless of whether she was with Yi Xiangnan or not, Shinting should be hers. That was why she did that year. Yihuan was confused. She suddenly realized that she might have been wrong in the past. Now, she was wrong again, but it didn't seem wrong. That vague feeling was driving her crazy. Her gaze fell on Shinting. He was sitting on the sofa. The sun shone in through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The room was beautiful. And he was still handsome. She looked at him, feeling as if she had missed something. All these years, perhaps she had missed Shinting. Back then, in Shinting's eyes, her actions were so hateful. And last night? She was just relying on his care and his life in the Qin family. But what was she relying on now? Shinting wanted to break away from the Qin family at any time and even control everything in the company. On the other hand, he had Anan. What she was doing now seemed laughable. Yihuan had never felt so embarrassed before. She lowered her eyes and bit her lip, not saying anything for a long time. Shinting put his phone away and looked at her. Then, he smiled faintly. You don't seem like such a weak person. He got up and walked beside her. His slender and good-looking palm landed on her hair. Settle the matter properly. As for the rest, you can think about it. No one will force you. However, think about it carefully. Don't be as stupid as a pig. I'm not a pig. Yihuan bit her lip. Have you ever seen a pig as beautiful as me? The common trait is stupidity. He said bluntly, you want to figure out something that you haven't figured out for more than 10 years? That's not very likely. Just take care of the things at hand. The subtext was, you and your ex-boyfriend have a clean separation, then come back to me. How could Yihuan hear that? She was sad now. She looked up at Shinting. Shinting seemed to be very calm. At least, he was much calmer than her. She couldn't tell what he was thinking. She felt that he was implying something, but she also felt that she was overthinking things. Plus, Yi Xiangnan and Anan. Therefore, the pig became lazy and didn't want to think about it anymore. Thinking about it gave him a headache. When she got into his car, Shinting patted her head and said, Qin Yihuan, you can't think it through for 2 years, can you? Huh? What 2 years? Shinting buckled his seatbelt and said calmly, you've been in Italy for 2 years. You should be able to think and decide some things, right? That was a very obvious hint. It should be a clear hint. Her heart raced as she bit her lip and was at a loss. The world was really fantastical. Yesterday, she was still Yi Xiangnan's fiancée. But in less than a day, Shinting was asking her for the results. No. She thought about it. Where's Anan? Shinting started the car and said calmly, she's not a pig. There's no way she can't find a man. He was calling her a pig again. My toothache is killing me. I'll fix it tomorrow, it should be updated at noon. Chapter 48:16. Memorize. Yihuan glanced at him, her eyes misty. An indescribable feeling. Shinting smiled and focused on driving. They arrived at Kin Entertainment at about 9 o'clock in the morning. Shinting did not get out of the car, even though he knew that Yi Xiangnan would probably meet her today. It wasn't that he didn't care, but after so many years, he couldn't afford to care anymore. Besides, she was his now. Although he did not say it out loud, he knew that she would always be his. Ever since she was 18, everything had changed. She just didn't want to admit it. All these years, he had been angry because she had clearly liked him, but after that night, she had still chosen to be with Yi Xiangnan. This was what Shinting couldn't accept the most, and it was what he was especially angry about. But now, she was no longer Yi Xiangnan's. She was ignorant of his feelings, but he could feel that she was definitely not ignorant. The car stopped, and Shinting leaned over to open the door for her. He smiled and said, "I'll pick you up tonight." Yi Huan bit her lower lip. "I might not be able to get off work on time. I'll take the company's car back." When she got out of the car, she suddenly turned around and bent down. "What time are you coming home?" Shinting's gaze fell on her face with some concentration. After a while, he smiled. 6 o'clock. After a pause, he said, "I'll cook." Yi Huan said weakly, "But I might not be able to get home on time for dinner." "Go home." A faint smile appeared on Shinting's face. "I'll wait for you." Yi Huan wanted to say something, but she swallowed her words in the end. Shinting smiled. "Hurry up and go. The public relations department must be going crazy." Yesterday was just the beginning. Today was the day it would completely ferment. Shinting no longer doted on her like a child. He doted on her at home, but in King Entertainment, Yi Huan was the CEO. She couldn't hide behind him. Moreover, Shinting believed that she had such an ability. After he finished speaking, Yi Huan bit her lower lip and gently closed the door for him. Shinting glanced at her again as the black sports car slowly slid away. Yi Huan turned her head. Secretary Lin was waiting for her. She sighed and said, "President Qin, it's quite difficult. The Public Relations Department has arranged a press conference, and you need to attend it. Normal people can go everywhere to heal after breaking up, but I still have to explain to everyone. I don't know if it's me or them who have broken up." Yi Huan also sighed and walked straight to the elevator. He had been busy the whole day, and things were very troublesome. In the morning, King Entertainment's stock price had plummeted quite severely. They had held a press conference and announced it at the same time as Starlight. From now on, the two companies would still be in a cooperative relationship. Only then did the decline slow down. At noon, Yi Huan received a call from Yi Xiangnan. The two of them didn't speak for a long time. After about half a minute, Yi Xiangnan said softly, "Do you want to have dinner together? Is this the last dinner?" Yi Huan's voice was a little light. Yi Xiangnan hesitated for a few seconds before saying, "You can say that." Yi Huan lowered her gaze and agreed. She set a time and place with him. They had broken up, but it was impossible for them to become enemies. For the sake of the company and the stock, they had to maintain a superficial relationship. Moreover, Yi Huan felt guilty, especially after last night. After hanging up, she played with her phone for a while, deleting all the photos of Yi Xiangnan. After deleting them, she was in a daze, feeling a little stifled. Chapter 48:17. After hanging up, she played with her phone for a while and deleted all the pictures of Yi Xiangnan. After deleting them, she was in a trance and felt a little suffocated. Secretary Lin brought her lunch and put it down gently. Seeing that Yi Huan was in a trance, Secretary Lin said softly, "President Shen said that President Qin's health is not very good, so the food delivered to the mansion will be lighter these days." Yi Huan looked up and asked, "Shinting?" Secretary Lin nodded and looked puzzled. "President Shen decides the food delivered to the mansion every day. Don't you know that, President Qin?" Yi Huan was even more dazed. It took her a long time to come back to her senses. "You mean President Shen decides the food every day?" Secretary Lin said matter-of-factly, "Who else can it be? The old President Qin doesn't care about these things, but the young President Qin only likes to play with technology and doesn't care about the company's affairs. No one else but President Shen will worry about such trivial things." Yi Huan bit her lower lip and stared at the wooden lunch boxes in front of her. She said softly, "You can leave first." She still couldn't digest this reality. Her relationship with Shinting had been stiff for many years, and he had been preparing lunch for her all these years. What kind of feelings did he have? Yi Huan didn't know, and she was a little afraid to find out. Perhaps it was because she was afraid of letting him down. Reaching out to open the lunch boxes, she looked at the dishes she liked. Her eyes were a little misty. All these years, she seemed to have been very capricious. She did what she wanted to do willfully and never considered Shinting's feelings. As she ate, she felt even more upset. At this moment, the phone in her hand rang. It was a WeChat message. It was Shinting's profile picture. Yi Huan opened it. He simply sent a few words. What do you want to eat tonight? I'll make it. She looked at these words carefully for a long time. Then, almost carefully, she typed, calm down, I'll be home around 8. Shinting only replied with one word. Perhaps he was really busy. Yihuan quietly looked at those lines of words, feeling a little unreal. She had been back from abroad for a few days, and too many things had happened. She still couldn't wrap her head around it. She ate her food slowly. Usually, she would only eat half of it. But today, she had eaten the whole thing. Secretary Lin came over personally to clean it up and smiled. The news outside has been suppressed. The trending topic has been removed as well. They've arranged for Xiao Hua to be in a relationship. Qin Yihuan nodded and didn't say anything. Secretary Lin continued, this time, we were actually implicated by Star Entertainment. The impact will be stopped soon, but Star Entertainment's problem is not small. President Qin, if CEO Yi asks for your cooperation today, you can't be too soft-hearted. Secretary Lin could be considered as a trusted aide, which was why he would say such considerate words. King Entertainment and Stars Entertainment were essentially entertainment companies. Now that something like this had happened, it was actually better to destroy the other party. Not only could they vent their anger, but they could also monopolize the industry. Qin Yihuan tilted her head and looked at Secretary Lin. Of course, she knew that this was a great opportunity. She was hesitating. In fact, she didn't have such thoughts at first. After all, the two companies had been strategic partners all these years. Now that there was a loophole in Stars Entertainment, Yihuan's eyes narrowed slightly. Secretary Lin knew her decision and immediately said seriously, I'll get someone to write a draft immediately. Once it's done, I'll let President Qin have a look. Chapter 48:18. Secretary Lin knew her decision and said seriously, I'll get someone to write a draft right away and let President Qin have a look after it. After all, they were ex-lovers. It was better not to be too ugly. However, Yihuan raised her hand and said, no need. You guys can do as you see fit. Secretary Lin was surprised. Did she mean for them to do whatever they wanted? However, this was also unexpected. This was President Qin's style. Secretary Lin quickly retreated. Yihuan was still sitting quietly as she looked at Shinting's message again. At 6:00 in the evening, she got into the driver's car and went to a famous Western restaurant. When she arrived, Yi Xiangnan was already waiting for her. Yihuan walked over and sat down opposite him. Yi Xiangnan glanced at the waiter, who immediately poured a glass of apéritif. Yihuan took off her coat and put it on the back of the chair. She smiled lightly and said, I haven't been feeling well recently, so I can't drink. Yi Xiangnan looked at her deeply and moved her apéritif to his side. He held it with his slender fingers and took a sip. He said softly, how are you? Yihuan let out a long breath and said, I'm fine. How about you? He put down the slender goblet in his hand and smiled faintly. Do you think I'll be fine? Yihuan looked down and said, I'm sorry. I've touched a sore spot for you. Yi Xiangnan reached out and grabbed her hand. Yihuan was shocked and wanted to pull her hand away, but Yi Xiangnan was too strong. He held her hand almost stubbornly, his voice low and husky as hell. He said in a low voice, do you know why none of us made it to the end? Yihuan looked into his eyes. Yi Xiangnan did not care about other people's gazes. He held her hand and said in a low voice, I'm not looking for an excuse. It's just that many years ago, we were different. Yihuan blinked her eyes gently. Yi Xiangnan laughed a little self-deprecatingly. Yihuan, which part of me is inferior to him? Was he referring to Shinting? Yihuan did not ask, but she knew in her heart that he was talking about Shinting. Her lips moved slightly. Yi Xiangnan stopped her. Don't tell me it's not true. Yihuan, you can deceive others, but you can't deceive yourself. Yi Xiannan finally let go of her and leaned against the back of the chair. She sighed as she said, I don't know when it started, but you've been talking about Shinting and Shinting. Yihuan, you're not wrong. You're just too slow. And Shinting should also know about it. He just waited patiently. Perhaps it was because he had the same pride as him that he kept waiting. So did he. So the three of them had wasted so many years, and now they were finally free. In this incident, the one who suffered the most was not Yihuan, but him, Yi Xiannan. No one could know what he was thinking, nor could they understand his feelings. He was about to marry a woman he didn't like, understand, or know. Otherwise, his child would be an illegitimate child, which was not allowed in the Yi family. But he really liked Yihuan. He used to like her very much, but later, he didn't dare to love her. Because he knew that she would belong to someone else sooner or later. Yi Xiangnan said so much, but Yihuan just smiled. Then she looked straight at him. Yi Xiangnan, if you think I like someone else, I've been with you all the time. You haven't tried to make me like you. She stared at him, and her eyes were a little misty. Chapter 48:19. She stared at him, her eyes misting up. He and Shinting both said that they liked her and that they loved her, but she also wanted a certain amount of love and affection. She wasn't an object that could be made do with. She didn't know what was wrong between them, but she wasn't the only one who was the problem. She wouldn't take the blame. After she said that, Yi Xiangnan was stunned. After a long time, he smiled bitterly. It's my fault? Yes, it was his fault. They had been together for so many years, but he had never thought about making it up. Instead, he watched her unhappy. He was even more despicable than Shinting. That man? Yihuan let him down, but he let Yihuan down. Yi Xiangnan finally understood that it wasn't that she had left, but that he had lost her. His throat tightened. There were many things he wanted to say, but in the end, he couldn't say a word. He could only eat quietly with her. Yihuan lowered her head and looked at the steak on the plate. She said softly, I won't be too gentle with Star's entertainment in the future. Yi Xiannan seemed taken aback, but when he looked up, he smiled again in an obvious manner. He said softly, as expected. That's you. Yihuan took a sip of the soup and said softly, thank you for understanding. Yi Xiangnan's eyes always had a look of longing. He still remembered how she was when she was young. She would always follow behind him and call him Big Brother Xiangnan. When she grew up, she wouldn't call him that. He thought that he had always liked her, but she didn't like him. It was Shinting, the man who had always been by her side. Yi Xiangnan let out a long breath. Why aren't you eating? Don't you have an appetite? I don't really have an appetite. I'll get the auntie to cook something light when we get back. Yihuan smiled and said nonchalantly. But she still accompanied him to finish dinner, although she did not eat much. When they were leaving, Yi Xiangnan offered to give her a ride. Yihuan shook her head and refused. The driver is waiting for me. She looked at him and whispered, take care. This was the best way for her to end their relationship. There were no tears or curses. It was not because she was gentlemanly, but because they had stopped loving each other a long time ago. If they didn't love each other, there was no need to tie each other down. When Yihuan got in the car, Yi Xiangnan suddenly stopped her. Yihuan. She paused, then turned her head and looked at him. Yi Xiangnan smiled faintly. You're living with Shinting now, right? Yihuan was stunned. After a while, she smiled and didn't deny it. This time, she did not deny it. She was herself for once. As for whether Yi Xiangnan would tell Bai Anan and whether Bai Anan would cause trouble for Shinting, that was Shinting's business. Since he wanted her to live with him, he was prepared for Bai Anan to know. Yihuan suddenly thought that maybe she was just maturing now. She would not ask about him and Bai Anan. He said 2 years to let her understand everything. She thought that 2 years was also what she wanted to give him. If he couldn't bear to be with Bai Anan in these 2 years, she would give him her blessings. Yihuan smiled and took a step back. Brother Xiangnan, take care. On such a late autumn night, Yi Xiangnan's eyes were a little moist. He couldn't help going forward and hugging her. You too. After all, they had grown up together. This hug made him realize that he still loved her. Chapter 48:20. After all, they had grown up together. After this hug, he realized that he still loved her. But his pride let her go. He had so many years to use. If only he had treated her better and put in more effort, he would not have thrown her away. Just as they were hugging, there was a flash somewhere. It was obvious that someone had taken a photo. Yi Xiangnan turned his head, but he did not find the person who had taken the photo. Yihuan shook her head. Forget it. Because even if it was exposed, she would say that it was a previous photo and deny it. Yi Xiangnan could guess what she was thinking. He shook his head and looked at her deeply. Let's go back. There was someone waiting for her. Yihuan got into the car. The driver asked her if she was going to the apartment or the villa. Yihuan told him Shinting's address. The driver was surprised. He knew that it was where young Master Shen lived. Was Missy going to live together? Yihuan sensed his thoughts and snorted. Uncle Firewood, what are you thinking? Shinting is my brother. Uncle Firewood laughed. Yes, he is a good brother. But young Master is already over 30. It's time for him to start a family. His career is already so good. He can't be busy with work all day. Yihuan felt that there was a hidden meaning in his words. But she could not refute him at the same time. She only snorted. Uncle Firewood stopped while he was ahead. He just kept laughing. When the car stopped at Shinting's apartment, there was a person standing in the hall. It was none other than Shinting. Uncle Firewood laughed even more happily. When he opened the door, he joked, if you stick to your brother like this, he won't be able to find a wife. Yihuan glared at Uncle Firewood, but Uncle Firewood didn't mind. He nodded at Shanting as a form of greeting and left. Yihuan stood there. Seeing Shanting come over, she snorted. Uncle Firewood, you are good at pretending. Shanting was wearing a set of home clothes and was clean. He must have taken a shower. He stood next to her and watched the black car drive away. What did he do to you? He looked so unhappy. Yihuan glanced at him and said naturally, he said it's my fault that you can't find a wife. Shanting glanced at her again and walked towards the elevator. Yihuan followed beside him. I haven't done anything for the past few years. Once isn't enough? He stopped in front of the elevator and suddenly turned around. Yihuan was startled and her body involuntarily retreated. However, she retreated too quickly and was about to hit the wall. Shanting reached out and hooked her back, but the result was that their bodies were stuck together. She tried to break free, but he didn't let her. He trapped her at the elevator door, holding her tightly. Yihuan bit her lower lip. Shanting, are you crazy? Let go of me. He didn't let go and just stared at her from above. Yihuan kicked him a little rudely. Don't forget that you have a girlfriend. He sneered. Is this the reason you had a meal with Yi Xiangnan? Yihuan was stunned. She only spoke after a while. How did you know? This was no different from admitting it. She thought for a moment and said, it's Uncle Firewood. He must be the one who snitched on me. Traitor. Rotten to the core. Shanting's voice was indifferent. I can guess it even if Uncle Firewood didn't say it. With that said, he pressed the button for the elevator. Yihuan didn't realize that he had successfully changed the topic. After entering the elevator, he quickly let go of her and Yihuan naturally rolled to the other side. Chapter 48-21. Shanting's voice was indifferent. I can guess it even if Uncle Firewood doesn't say it. With that, he pressed the elevator button. Yihuan didn't notice that he had successfully changed the topic. After entering the elevator, he quickly let go of her, and Yihuan naturally rolled to the other side. The atmosphere was a little subtle. At least, she was embarrassed. She flipped her hair and said uncomfortably, well, we just have something to talk about. I don't want you to explain. Shanting smiled gently. You don't need to explain to me. If I have to be jealous of this, I would have died of jealousy all these years. What? What jealousy? What did he say? Yihuan bit her lower lip and refused to accept this information. Shanting didn't say anything more. At this time, the elevator arrived. He took her back to his apartment. Yihuan felt uncomfortable. When she changed her slippers, she asked him, why are you waiting downstairs? Nothing, it's convenient. He said with a smile. Then he led the way to the dining room. Okay, let's eat. Yihuan followed behind and cleared her throat. Actually, I'm quite full. I'll just eat something casually. She said it firmly, but her stomach failed to live up to her expectations. It was very embarrassing. Shanting smiled. Didn't Yi Xiangnan let you have a good meal? He said it gently, but there was a touch of undetectable heartache in his tone. If it was in the past, Yihuan would never have heard it. But after what happened at noon, she was very sensitive to it. She sat down, ate a mouthful of rice, and secretly looked at the dishes in front of her. Then she said in a low voice, I have no appetite after eating the steak. Doesn't he know that you're not in good health? Shanting said casually. Yihuan was stunned for a moment. She instinctively said, he doesn't know. Shanting stared at her. He knows. Therefore, this was why Yi Xiangnan and Qin Yihuan couldn't go to the end. If they didn't care about each other sincerely, how could they be called lovers? Even if it was the last meal, if Yi Xiangnan had been concerned about her, he would have known that she couldn't eat Western food. In the end, it was still not suitable. Yihuan was someone who needed someone to take good care of her. Obviously, Yi Xiangnan wasn't that person. Shanting didn't say much. He helped her put some food in her bowl. In the future, if you're hungry, find something to eat. If you have an important social engagement, if you don't want to stay, just come back, okay? She just looked straight at him. You're like teaching a child. Aren't you? He smiled. You're holding a milk bottle. If you're not a child, what are you? I'm not. She wanted to explain, but in the end, she felt that there was no need to explain to Shanting. In the end, she buried her head in the food. Eating the delicious food, she was in a good mood. It seemed that she hadn't eaten Shanting's cooking for a long time. His cooking had always been good, and it was for her own good. Now, she thought that if he married someone else one day, she would be at a disadvantage. What are you thinking about? Shanting knocked on her forehead. Eat your food. Your blood test is not up to standard. What will you do if you go to Italy? Can I bring the chef over? She raised her head, her eyes seemed to be filled with stars. Shanting smiled. The chef might have a lot of things to do. By the way, didn't you say that you have a girlfriend? I'm not talking about you. Yihuan buried her head. Don't flatter yourself. Chapter 48:22. Can I bring the chef over? She raised her head, her eyes seemed to be filled with stars. Enchanting smiled. The chef might have a lot of things to do. By the way, didn't you say that you have a girlfriend? I'm talking about you, not you. Yihuan buried her head. Don't flatter yourself. Enchanting smiled and ate quietly. He didn't eat much, and most of the time, he was serving food for her. Yihuan ate until she was a little full. She rubbed her stomach and smiled at Enchanting embarrassedly. Enchanting also looked at her quietly. After a while, he smiled. Go watch TV when you're full. I'll clean up. Yihuan was a little embarrassed. Let me do it. She was embarrassed to let Enchanting do everything. It seemed like he was the one taking care of her, and it wasn't good. Enchanting looked at her and actually agreed. I happen to have a few plans that I want to look at. Thank you for your hard work. Yihuan made a face at him and then began to clean up. Where should she start? She bit her lower lip and secretly looked at Enchanting. Enchanting was buried in work. He was still on the sofa in the living room instead of going to the study. She had peeked into his study room, and she had clearly said so generously. Thinking about it, she put it back to the work at hand. Yihuan, who had never done any housework, carried the plates into the kitchen one by one. She didn't want the rest of the dishes, so she threw them away and put on an apron. It was a pink apron. She didn't know why he had a pink apron here. But Enchanting knew that he bought it last time when he went to the home store. At that time, he didn't expect her to do housework. In fact, he ate out most of the time. If he ate at home, there would be a part-time helper, but no one would come these days. He chose to cook for her himself. Enchanting could see the kitchen from where he was sitting. He happened to see Yihuan standing in front of the counter in a small apron. She looked like a little wife handling the household chores. He stared at it for a while, smiled faintly, and continued to immerse himself in his work. Yihuan, on the other hand, was struggling with those plates. Actually, there was a dishwasher, but she didn't know how to do it, so she washed them by hand. Wearing gloves, it was slippery, and soon, the plates in her hands fell to the ground. After a crisp sound, a small cut appeared on her calf, and a little blood seeped out. With her constitution, she was prone to bleeding. Even the slightest wound could cause her to bleed profusely. Yihuan frowned as she stared at it. She didn't know what to do. At this moment, Enchanting came over. He looked at her and quickly squatted down. No one dared to touch it for fear of getting infected. Go to the living room, I'll help you deal with it. If it doesn't work, you'll have to go to the hospital, he said firmly. Yihuan let out an ah, but he had already picked her up. Afraid that she would fall, she instinctively hugged his neck. But she felt that it was inappropriate to hug him, and it was even more abrupt to put him down. Hence, she clenched her fists helplessly. Enchanting glanced at her and didn't say anything more. He hurried to the living room and put her down on the sofa. He swept the documents to the side, not caring about them at all. Yihuan bit her lip and watched as he went to get the first aid kit and came back quickly. He was still squatting down, holding her calf with one hand and looking up at her. It's a little painful, bear with it. Oh, she replied. Be gentle. Chapter 48:23. But no matter how gentle he was, she still felt the pain, the kind that tears were about to come out. But no matter how gentle he was, she still felt a lot of pain, the kind that was about to burst into tears. Yihuan was really holding it in. Her pain threshold was very low to begin with, but now it really hurt, and she was afraid of blood. Enchanting put her foot on his knee. She immediately retracted her foot, but Enchanting caught it. Don't move. Don't move. He said gently and softly again, then looked at her. Observe for a while. If the blood is still flowing, I'll take you to the hospital. Yihuan was quite afraid. She was quite afraid every time she bled, afraid that her blood would run out. This time, she was also afraid, but she didn't know why. Because Enchanting was there, she wasn't so afraid anymore. Even when she went to the hospital, he accompanied her. Later, he put her foot on the sofa and sat beside her. Yihuan leaned her head on his shoulder, but her foot was still on his knee. Will I die? What nonsense are you talking about? Enchanting was a little speechless. Don't talk nonsense. At this moment, Yihuan was indescribably fragile. She leaned on his shoulder. I don't know how many times I've changed my blood since I was young, and I don't know how many people's blood I've had. It's not good. Enchanting's eyes darkened, but in the end, he didn't say anything. Yihuan bit her lip and stared at her leg. After a while, she said softly, it's bleeding again. Enchanting saw it too. He reached out and touched her little head, then said softly, "I'll take you to the hospital." She grabbed his arm. "Shinting." He lowered his head and smiled. "I'm here, don't be afraid." Yihuan smiled lightly. "I'm not afraid." She just felt that it was strange that they had to go to the hospital so soon after they resumed their previous relationship. Shinting didn't think too much about it. He took the jacket and put it on for her. It was a little cold outside, so Shinting buttoned it up one button at a time. After putting it on, Yihuan realized that the jacket was Shinting's. She paused for a moment. "These are your clothes. Wear it. It can block the wind." Shinting was wearing home clothes, but he could still go out. Just like that, he carried her out until they reached the car downstairs. The air conditioner in the car was turned on. She wanted to take off her coat, but Shinting shook his head. "We'll be there soon. Put it on." He looked down and then back at her face. "Don't look down later." Yihuan exclaimed again, "Why?" She didn't know why, but she was bleeding so fast that the gauze was completely red. Shinting started the car and drove a little fast. They arrived at the hospital in less than 10 minutes. During the whole process, Yihuan did not speak. When the car stopped, she whispered, "I feel a little dizzy." It was because he had lost too much blood. She was very obedient and did not look down. Shinting reached out and gently pinched her cheek. "Good girl." With that said, he quickly opened the car door and got out of the car. He opened the door from her side and carried her up. His expression was very calm, but when he carried her, he walked very fast. His feet almost didn't touch the ground. When they arrived at the emergency room, they showed the card. The doctor quickly found blood from the blood bank and gave it to Yihuan. Yihuan lay on the hospital bed, her face a little pale. Shinting accompanied her, his fingers intertwined with hers. His voice was very soft. "Sleep. It'll be good when you wake up." Yihuan's eyes were wide open. She shook her head. "No, I don't want to sleep." Chapter 48-24. Because she was afraid that she wouldn't wake up if she fell asleep. Every time she received a blood transfusion, she would fall asleep and never wake up again. Shinting's voice became softer and gentler. "I will always be here with you. Be good and close your eyes." At this moment, his expression was extremely doting, just like when she was young and he would coax her to sleep every night. Yihuan's eyes were a little dazed. Then, she gently leaned her head on his arm, like a cute little animal, and said softly, "I can't bear to." Shinting was overjoyed to hear that. He knew what she meant, but he restrained himself. He shouldn't be so fast, at least not at this time. In 2 years, if she didn't change her mind, they would get married immediately. Perhaps, in his heart, he was afraid that she would regret it and leave him again. If he couldn't bear it, he would really hate her and not give up, but he would use all kinds of means to make her belong to him from then on. She wouldn't like that. Shinting's fingers gently stroked her fluffy hair, comforting her bit by bit. Under his comfort, Yihuan fell asleep. She slept soundly and deeply, as if her whole body had been injected with new energy. Her whole body was warm. It was indescribably comfortable. Shinting's gaze was very warm. He couldn't help but lower his head and kiss the little girl. Then, he couldn't help but kiss her forehead. At this time, the doctor came in and coughed lightly. "Mr. Shen, there is not enough blood in the blood bank, do you want to draw mine?" Shinting said calmly. The doctor nodded. Shinting had drawn 300 this time, and only used 100. The rest was still in the blood bank for backup. In the middle of the night, Shinting was also tired, and in the end, he slept beside her. He lay there, unable to sleep because the lights were on. But Yihuan was afraid of the dark, so he accommodated her. They hugged each other like this until 4 in the morning, when he felt a little sleepy. It was a deep sleep. When Yihuan woke up, it was 8 o'clock in the morning. The nurse came to clean up. Seeing her awake, she greeted her with a smile. "Miss Qin, are you awake?" Yihuan scratched her head and sat up. She looked at Shinting and felt a little uncomfortable. "President Shen, are you going to sleep here for the night?" The nurse smiled. "No, Mr. Shen stayed up for the first half of the night and went to draw blood again in the middle of the night. By the way, Mr. Shen treats Miss Qin really well. He draws blood almost once a month and puts it in the blood bank. Almost all the blood Miss Qin uses is donated by Mr. Shen." Yihuan was stunned. It was all Shinting's blood? All these years, she had used so much blood. Just as she was about to ask, the nurse continued, "Even when Mr. Shen was abroad for a few years, he would fly back once every 2 months to prepare blood for Miss Qin." Yihuan was completely stunned. She knew how busy Shinting had been living abroad for the past few years. It had been like a devil's training, but he had flown back every 2 months to draw her blood. He clearly didn't need to do so. She didn't know what to say. At this moment, Shinting woke up. The nurse glanced at him and immediately left with the things. The door was closed, but the atmosphere in the ward was quite subtle. Yihuan was the first to speak and asked in a low voice, "Is what she said true?" Actually, she knew that she was asking too much. It must be true. Shinting didn't answer her question directly, but asked her softly, "Are you hungry?" Chapter 48-25. Updated quickly. Actually, she knew that she was asking too much, and it had to be true. Shinting didn't answer her question directly, but asked her softly, "Are you hungry?" Yihuan stared at his face and bit her lip. What's the difference?" Shinting smiled. "Isn't it normal? If it were someone else, they would have done the same." As soon as he finished speaking, he was hugged by a pair of slender arms. Yihuan buried her face in his chest and said softly, "It's different." She might not want it if it was made by someone else. Shinting lowered his head and said hoarsely, "What's different? Tell me." She shook her head again and refused to tell him. Shinting smiled and didn't force her. He just reached out and touched her hair lovingly. "All right, I'll go make breakfast for you. I want to eat what you make." Perhaps it was because she was injured, but she was especially soft and clingy. She simply stuck to his chest and refused to come out. Shinting couldn't bring himself to say that he had a girlfriend anymore. Even if he said it, it wouldn't be convincing. Because the fact that he brought her to live in his house said it all. Shinting wasn't someone without principles. He brought her back even though he had a girlfriend. Actually, she knew that Baianin was just an excuse for the other party. That way, it wouldn't be so awkward for them to get along. Shinting patted her little head. "All right, I'll do it." Satisfied, she let go of him and sat on the bed. Was it because she was injured? At this moment, her phone rang. She picked it up and saw that it was Secretary Lin calling to ask about what they had talked about yesterday. As the chief secretary, she had to ask again about the matter of trampling on Star's entertainment. Yihuan said it briefly. However, Shinting could understand what she was trying to say. He just smiled and didn't say anything, continuing to make breakfast in the small kitchen of the VIP ward. Yihuan bit her lower lip. "Shinting, Yi Xiangnan and I were photographed last night." Shinting's fingers paused and he looked at her. Yihuan felt guilty and whispered, "Actually, it's nothing. I won't admit it." He continued to work, but after a while, he asked her, "Are you trying to explain to me?" He asked in a serious manner, and Yihuan answered in a serious manner as well. "Sort of." Shinting did not say anything else. Yihuan's heart was in a mess when he did not speak. She bit her lower lip. "Shinting." He stewed the porridge and turned around. "If you have to ask me, my answer is that I'm angry, but I won't lash out because of it. Because it was something that she and Yi Xiangnan hadn't handled well." Yihuan shouted, "Why are you so generous?" Shinting sighed softly. "Then how do you want me to express my anger? Should I turn around and leave or not make breakfast for you?" Yihuan didn't say anything. She hugged her knees and said after a long time, "Xiangnan said it was because of me." "I know." Shinting smiled. "It's because you're too stupid." Yihuan glared at him. Seriously, she couldn't even quarrel with him. But she didn't know that this was Shinting's line of demarcation. If she dared to be ambiguous with anyone in the future, his emotions would flare up for her to see. Yihuan looked at him with some bitterness. After a while, she suddenly said, "Someone took a picture of me being hospitalized last night, and it's irrefutable evidence that we lived together. Someone even said, we came to the hospital last night because. Chapter 48-26. Memorize from her expression, Shinting could guess what she wanted to say. He looked at her and chuckled. "Because of what?" Yihuan whispered. Shinting raised his eyebrows, looking surprised and amused. "Am I that cruel?" Yihuan blushed. After a while, she snorted, "How would I know?" Shinting's smile deepened. "If you don't know, then who does?" Yihuan widened her eyes and stared at him. Shinting just smiled and went back to the kitchen. Soon, he had prepared breakfast. It was light and sweet. Yihuan sniffed. "Oh, I think I'm hungry." Shinting smiled and put the breakfast on the small dining table. Yihuan wanted to get off the bed, but he stopped her. "Don't move, I'll carry you over." She sat at the head of the bed, her feet swinging gently. "I'm fine now." Shinting's gaze landed on the bandage on her calf and he smiled faintly. "Yes, but the doctor said that it's best not to walk around today." Still, he picked her up. Yihuan opened her eyes wide and stared at him. "But I have to go to the company today. I still have something to deal with." As she spoke, her arms hooked around his neck. Shinting said without thinking, "If there's anything, ask Secretary Lin to come over." You don't even have the right to stay in the hospital when you're injured? If they were this busy, King Entertainment's performance would have long surpassed Star's Entertainment's. All these years, he had been working on other areas. Starlight was still focusing on the entertainment industry and was already one of the top 5 entertainment companies in the world. This was all thanks to Yi Xiangnan's hard work, while King Entertainment had shrunk in this area. Yihuan wanted to say something, but she shut her mouth. After all, it was true that she had not made any achievements after taking over, so she had no position to stand on. Shinting looked at her, placed her on the dining chair, and scooped a bowl of porridge for her. Yihuan took 2 bites and suddenly looked up to ask him, "Are you going to the company today?" "Of course," Shinting said softly. For some reason, Yihuan felt a sense of loss in her heart. It was an indescribable feeling. She lowered her head and made a sound of acknowledgement, but didn't say anything else. Shinting tilted his head and looked at her. He probably knew that she was unhappy, so he smiled lightly and said, "There's an important meeting at the company today." Was that an explanation? Yihuan also knew that she seemed to be too unreasonable. She looked up at him and said, "You don't have to accompany me. I can do it myself." Shinting smiled faintly and did not say anything else. After finishing his breakfast, he informed the doctor and nurses before heading to the company. Outside, it was still a bloodbath. Especially since he and Yihuan had been photographed by the reporters, coupled with the sudden situation last night, it was hard not to think about it. There were over 100 reporters below King Group. Shinting got out of the car and walked to the lobby on the first floor under the escort of the security guards. The reporters kept asking him about his relationship with Yihuan. Shinting was at the top of the stairs. He turned his head and said with a hint of warmth in his indifferent expression, "Yihuan is my family." These 2 words were actually a little warm and ambiguous. They could advance or retreat at any time. The reporters weren't idiots. Of course they could tell. But even though they could tell, they didn't dare to write carelessly. President Shen wasn't someone to be trifled with. His temper was even worse. Hence, for a long time, no one dared to make a sound. Shinting glanced around and entered the building. Chapter 48-27. It was true that there were meetings in the company. Otherwise, he would have been with Yihuan all the time. Bai Anan was also present for important meetings. She was a senior consultant hired by Shinting, but her role was not particularly glorious. In the industry, Bai Anan was not someone to be trifled with. She was tall and beautiful, but her actions were ruthless. When the media exposed that she was with Shinting, there were cheers from all sides. They were really a perfect match. At this time, Bai Anan had already arrived at the conference room and sat in her seat. The other middle and senior executives had not arrived yet. Shinting and Secretary Wang entered together. Secretary Wang saw that Bai Anan had arrived so early, so he immediately left. Lawyer Bai looked like she was going to interrogate him today. In the conference room, Shinting sat down with his tie and smiled. "Lawyer Bai, you are very early today." Bai Anan leaned back in the chair and looked at Shinting quietly. "President Shen used to call me Bai Anan. Why are you so distant now?" Shinting flipped through the documents. Why ask when you know the answer? There was no point in being pretentious anymore. Bai Anan shrugged and rested her chin on her hand. "It's really heartless. It's only been a few days. If we were suitable, we would have gotten married long ago. We wouldn't have waited so long," Shinting said straightforwardly. Bai Anan smiled a little reluctantly. After a while, she packed up her things. "You really don't beat around the bush," Shinting said quite sincerely. "I just don't want to have an affair." Bai Anan nodded. "I understand." She smiled in relief. "I won't mention it in the future." She had lost. No matter how long she waited, it was nothing compared to a word from Yihuan. In fact, she had already known that it was not the case. Shinting had never made any promises to her. However, she was still a little better than Xiangnan. At least she was still free, while Yi Xiangnan had to marry a woman he did not love. Just thinking about the Yi family's current situation made Bai Anan feel a headache. It was so headache that it was not a big deal for her to be heartbroken. Xiangnan is really similar to his father. Bai Anan thought unkindly. At this time, Secretary Wang opened the door, and the middle and upper management of the company came in together. In order to make it easier for them to talk privately, they were stopped by Secretary Wang for a few minutes. At this moment, Qin Xian was let in. He came over and sat on Shinting's left side, which happened to be opposite to Bai Anan. His surname was Qin, so he certainly knew about the turbulent relationship between Shinting and Yihuan. Yihuan had broken off the engagement. Shinting's state of mind was obvious. There was no suspense at all. However, Qin Xian took another look at Bai Anan. Bai Anan was 30 years old this year, the same age as Yi Xiangnan. She was usually indifferent, but she was actually a smiling tiger just like Shenting. Qin Xian hated women like her the most. Moreover, it was a woman older than him. At this time, he took a look at her. Sure enough, she was still acting as if nothing had happened when she was heartbroken. She was indeed made of iron. Qin Xian was not interested in women, so he just took a look at her. However, Bai Anan took another look at him and then narrowed her eyes. Shenting did not want her, and even Qin Xian, the unscrupulous businessman, dared to look down on her. She knew in her heart that he must be thinking that she was an old woman who could not get married at 30 years old. Bai Anan gritted her teeth. Qin Xian probably felt it, so he looked up and looked at her. Then, he raised his eyebrows and mouthed silently, "It's exactly what you think." Chapter 48-28. Bai Anan was about to explode. Qin Xian was extremely delicate and looked like a rich young master. Just a slight smile was enough to drive Bai Anan mad again. Shenting was presiding over the meeting. Their exchange of glances didn't escape his eyes. Shenting didn't say anything, but he frowned slightly. After the meeting, Shenting left first. It was still not too late for him to rush to the hospital for lunch. Secretary Wang had already asked the villa's chauffeur to deliver the food. Yihuan should have known he would be there when she saw the 2 lunch boxes. After Shenting left, the middle and upper management were discussing. It seems like there wasn't a conclusion in today's meeting. President Shen actually left just like that. There's no additional meeting in the afternoon. Yes, President Shen must have gone to see, Bai Anan picked up her briefcase and walked out as if she hadn't heard anything. When she reached the elevator, Qin Xian was in the same elevator as her. He leaned against the side of the elevator and said calmly, "Actually, it's not a big deal to fall out of love, but it's not good to force yourself. If you want to cry, just cry. What's so good about acting like a strong woman all day long? Isn't it too tiring?" Bai Anan stood up straight. "Thank you for classifying me as a female, Mr. Qin. You have no confidence?" Qin Xian smiled. "I thought, you were as confident as Yi Xiangnan." Indeed, the Yi family's 2 sons were both heavens players. They were arrogant and it was normal for them to think that they were especially powerful. However, it was also true that they had suffered setbacks in their relationships. How could anyone not vomit blood when they saw each other as a pair? Now, Bai Anan was a little envious that Yi Xiangnan had a wife to torture. What else could she do other than work? Bai Anan snorted coldly. "It's none of your business." She looked at Qin Xian suspiciously. "By the way, Mr. Qin is a tech upstart. Logically speaking, he should be quite clean, but I seem to have heard some bad rumors." If Shenting was a hidden knife in his smile, then Mr. Qin was the kind who didn't even bother to smile. He was so despicable that it was shameful. There were 3 evil people in this generation of the Qin family, including Qin Yihuan. Didn't she give Stars Light a hard slap this morning? Now, Xiangnan was cleaning up the mess. After Bai Anan finished, Qin Xian smiled faintly. "Lawyer Bai, if I remember correctly, you are our company special lawyer. The contract expires next week and I won't be taking over. So, young Master Qin, we might meet in court in the future." Bai Anan gently poked his heart with her finger and sneered, "Move aside, the elevator door is open." Qin Xian moved to the side and smirked. "That's right, Lawyer Bai will rush back to cry." Bai Xian turned and stared at. And Qin. And looked at Qin. Qin Xian's smile turned into a smile as he looked at her. His gaze was bottomless. Bai Anan snorted. "You're crazy." She left quickly. Qin Xian's gaze followed her. After a while, he turned and returned to his office. Secretary Wang came over and said softly, "President Qin, Mr. Shen said that he won't be coming back to the company in the afternoon. You will be in charge of the morning meeting." "I knew it." Qin Xian's voice was indifferent. "He's a workaholic. He won't let his subordinates off. But he was in love." Chapter 48-29. Secretary Wang came over and said softly, "President Qin, CEO Shen said that he won't be coming back to the office in the afternoon. You'll be in charge of the meeting in the afternoon." "I knew it." Qin Xian's voice was indifferent. "He's a workaholic. He won't let his subordinates off." Qin Xian leaned back in his chair and looked at Secretary Wang. Is love really so addictive? He was a workaholic, but he couldn't wait to fall in love. Secretary Wang pushed his glasses up and opened Baidu. Then, he said professionally, "When humans fall in love, they produce a substance called dopamine." All right, it's not biology class." Qin Xian's teeth hurt when he heard that. He sighed. All right, Secretary Wang, you can leave now. Secretary Wang was about to leave, but he paused. Oh yeah, actually, Lawyer Bai has a good personality. Won't President Qin consider her? Qin Xian frowned. Good? She's the same as CEO Shen. Will she be good? Secretary Wang smiled again. But President Qin likes to get along with CEO Shen. I thought they would get along better this way. Would they? Qin Xian just thought about Bai Ainan's indifference and let it go. He might prefer petite and cute girls, like Yi Hui, Yi Xiangnan's sister. However, he wasn't moved to the point where he had to date her, so he never took action. Qin Xian thought that he would probably remain unmarried for the rest of his life. He wasn't impulsive enough to want to spend the rest of his life with a woman. Secretary Wang saw his expression and sighed. Young Master Qin was 28 years old and had never been in love before. He didn't seem to be moved by any girl either. Could there be something wrong with him? That was why she used Lawyer Bai to test him. She really suspected that young President Qin and CEO Shen. He didn't dare to think about it anymore. It would be a sin to think about it. Secretary Wang left. Qin Xian turned on the computer and entered a few commands. However, when he looked closely, he realized that it was Bai Ainan's Baidu encyclopedia. He frowned. What the hell is this? But once he opened it, he would always take a look. With just a glance, all he could remember was a long list of titles, all kinds of excellence, and the fact that she was really 30 years old. Qin Xian closed his notebook. He had no interest in women older than himself. Anyone older than 25 would be called an old woman. On the other side, Bai Ainan sneezed for no reason. She held onto the steering wheel and wiped it with a tissue. He let out a long sigh and called Yi Hui. Do you have time to come out for a drink tonight? Yi Fenghui stuck out her tongue. The house is too messy next time, and then, you'll understand. This is. Bai Ainan threw down the phone. There's no one to accompany you even if you're heartbroken. Actually, it wasn't that bad. After all, she already knew that Enchanting didn't have any feelings for her. But she still faintly liked him and waited. Sure enough, men were all bastards. Bai Ainan drove directly to a clubhouse bar. After drinking for the whole afternoon, he wasn't too drunk, but he wasn't that sober either. She did something that wasn't sober and rational. She called Enchanting and gave him a good scolding. She scolded him in whatever unpleasant words she said. She just wanted to vent her anger. She wouldn't cry. She chose to scold this bastard. Enchanting was quite helpless, but at the same time, he was gentle. He asked where she was, then told her to wait there, while he dialed Qin Xian's number. Go pick up Bai Ainan and send her home. Chapter 4830. Enchanting hung up the phone and looked at Yi Huan. Yi Huan stared at him. He sighed and said, I know what you'll say. But it's definitely not what you think. Yi Huan leaned against the headboard and stared at Enchanting for a while. She whispered, have you kissed her? Enchanting didn't answer directly. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed and reached out to touch her face gently. Are you sure you want to know? Yi Huan stared at him for a long time and gave up after thinking for a long time. Enchanting was right. It might not be a good thing for her to know. Moreover, her woman's intuition told her that it was better for her not to know. She stopped asking and picked up her phone to play games for a while. She thought that Enchanting would always preach to her, such as patients need to rest or something, but he really didn't say anything. He just sat on the sofa to deal with his work. After a long time, Yi Huan finally couldn't help but say, Enchanting. He looked up and said, what's wrong? Do you want some water? I'll get it for you. She didn't say anything and just looked at him. Enchanting smiled knowingly and said, so you need to go to the bathroom? He was about to hug her, but Yi Huan stopped him. No, I don't want that. If you're very busy, you don't have to accompany me. Enchanting smiled faintly and buried himself in work again. It's the same here and in the company. How was it the same? There was a secretary in the company and it was comfortable at home. Anything was better than the hospital, wasn't it? But since he said that, Yi Huan couldn't say anything else. She played games for a while and then felt bored, so she put down the game and looked at him. It seemed that it had been a long time since she looked at him so closely and seriously. Enchanting was very good looking. He used to be gentle, but he seemed to have become a lot stricter in recent years. Yi Huan thought that it was probably lonely at the top. Thinking about it, she asked in a very soft voice, have you ever regretted it? When she asked, her body naturally leaned towards the side of the bed, closer to Enchanting. Enchanting put down his work and smiled. What's wrong? Yi Huan also smiled faintly. It's nothing. I just feel that, it's very tiring, so I'm asking if you regret it. Enchanting simply closed the notebook and put it aside. Then, he looked at Yi Huan with a serious expression. You suddenly asked. Yihuan remained silent. Shinting smiled faintly. Actually, I don't think it's hard. All ambitious men live like this. If he hadn't come to the Qin family, he might have had to take more detours and struggle less for at least 50 years. Thinking about it this way, didn't it make sense? However, he wouldn't tell Yihuan about this. He was telling the truth when he said that it wasn't hard. Hearing him say that it wasn't hard, Yihuan grabbed his arm and whispered, "Really?" Shinting smiled. Yes. Yihuan felt a little better, but she still didn't believe it. Shinting patted her face. Any man will think of ruling the world when he's awake and lying on the knees of a beautiful woman when he's drunk. Yihuan still opened her eyes and looked at him eagerly. Then you, Shinting smiled. Uncle Qin gave me a chance to rule the world, but the other one hasn't been realized yet. For some reason, Yihuan felt that this topic was more dangerous. It was better for her not to answer it. She pursed her lips and bit her teeth, looking a little cute. Shinting touched her hair. I'll get you a glass of water. No. She suddenly whispered. I want to go to the bathroom. In fact, it wasn't that she couldn't go. Shinting wasn't there in the morning, and she could go to the bathroom by herself. It was no problem at all, and she could be discharged tomorrow. But now she just wanted him to hug her. It was no more than a romantic feeling. She just wanted to be spoiled by Shinting like when she was a child. That should feel good. After she finished speaking, Shinting's eyes fell straight on her little face, as if he was a little uncertain. After a while, he said in a hoarse voice, "Okay." He hugged her and felt that she didn't weigh much. These days, he had hugged her a few times, but because of the special circumstances, he didn't feel it carefully. But at this moment, he felt that his hands were very light. So he frowned. You eat all day. Where do you eat all the time? Yihuan pouted. Nothing, I'm quite meaty. She regretted it the moment she said it. What did she say? Would Shinting think that she did it on purpose? The expression on Yihuan's face was very interesting. Shinting looked at her wrinkled little face and smiled. Yeah, you're quite meaty. The expression on Yihuan's face was even more interesting. She stared at him and couldn't believe that he was such a Shinting. Shinting finally put her down. His voice was slightly hoarse. Call me when you're done. With that said, he walked out like a gentleman. He stood guard outside the bathroom. After a while, he heard Yihuan meowing like a kitten. Shinting. He was about to pull the door open when she hurriedly said, Don't come in, don't come in. What's wrong? Shinting asked in a low voice at the door. Yihuan couldn't say it out loud. Because her period was here. It wasn't good for her to go out now, and she couldn't stand up. Shinting didn't hear her say anything and guessed the reason. He smiled silently and lowered his voice. I got it. Wait for a while. Oh, she replied obediently. Shinting came back in less than 5 minutes and passed the things in through the gap of the door. Yihuan didn't let him carry it back. She opened the door herself. Her face was a little red, and she didn't have the courage to ask him where he got the sanitary pads. Shinting just smiled. After she climbed into the bed, he poured her a glass of water and thought for a moment. Cook some red dates. It was good for blood. Yihuan replied, Oh. It was fine as long as she didn't eat red beans. On this issue, Shinting obviously didn't have the bad taste of Qin Mo. He knew that she didn't like it, so he kept feeding her red dates and never forced her to eat red beans. In this aspect, he was much better than Qin Mo. While he was cooking, Yihuan flipped through the book. She felt a little tired and wanted to sleep for a while. After Shinting finished, he came over and found that she had fallen asleep. His gaze became a little gentle, and he smiled slightly. Then, he went over and pushed her gently. Sleep after eating. I'm done. Yihuan rubbed her eyes and wanted to get up, but Shinting pressed her shoulders and said in a slightly low voice, Just sit on the bed. I'll feed you. Ah? Yihuan was surprised. Her mouth was slightly open, and she looked a little dazed. Shinting took the opportunity to feed her one. Surprised, Yihuan had no choice but to eat it. She looked at him while eating. Shinting was obviously in a very good mood. Why are you looking at me like that? Are you surprised? I used to feed you often. Chapter 48-31. Shinting took the opportunity to feed her one and Yihuan had no choice but to eat it in shock. She looked at him as she ate. Shinting was obviously in a good mood. Why are you looking at me like that? Are you surprised? Didn't I feed you often in the past? She replied naturally, that was in the past. It's different now. I've grown up and besides, she paused for a moment and her voice became soft. I thought you would hate me for a long time because of that. It's been so many years. Isn't that a long time? Shinting asked. Yihuan exclaimed. But a few days ago, you were still, with a sour face, wasn't it? He laughed. That's why single people are treated differently. That's because you're someone else's fiancé and you expect me to feed you. That kind of thinking is sinful, Miss Chin. Shinting teased her. Yihuan nodded her head deliberately and said, what you said makes sense. But Shinting, are you really alright? Of course. As he fed her, he said casually, I'm punishing you to go abroad for 2 years to reflect on your mistakes. Ah. This was clearly what she wanted to go. How did it become a punishment? Yihuan thought about it carefully and suddenly realized that she didn't want to go anymore. It was probably because she was too dependent on him and her life was too good by his side. And Shinting wanted her to go. It was a punishment. She suddenly realized that he was still angry. But she couldn't understand why he was so nice to her even though he was angry. After a while, she scoffed. Is this a test? Shinting smiled. If you want a reason, then that's it. Suddenly, Yihuan felt that Shinting was quite perverted. He was really tolerant. Yihuan ate the red dates and felt a little naughty in her heart. She hugged him and acted coquettishly. You're already 31. I'm going away for 2 years and I'll be 33. If we date for a few more years, I don't know if you can be a father at 40. I'll date for 2 years and get married when I return. Shinting said calmly. Yihuan's eyes widened in disbelief. I don't want it. We haven't even gotten to know each other. How can we get married just because you say so? She said, unconvinced. He put down the bowl in his hand and crossed his arms in front of him. You and Yi Xiangnan have been together for so many years. It doesn't matter how much time you spend together if you're not compatible. If you're compatible, you can get married within a month. Besides, what else do I not know about you? I was the one who helped you bathe when you were young. Yihuan was simply speechless. She could not speak for a long time and could only stare at him. Shinting chuckled. What's wrong? Are you unhappy? You're so overbearing, Yihuan muttered. Actually, it wasn't that she wasn't angry at all. Every girl wanted to be valued and not casually get married. They were very familiar with each other, but they used to get along as a family. How could it be the same? Shinting sighed softly. You finally know that I'm domineering, but all these years, I've never been domineering to you. Now, after all, he had the right to exercise it. Yihuan was still glaring at him. Shinting pinched her little face. I'll try. If I don't try, how will I know that you don't want to marry me? Maybe you'll cry and beg to marry me. Yihuan made a face at him. I won't cry and beg to marry someone. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.